FBI detective, this video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 151, The Importance of Incognito Browsing. A woman. Lassie was stunned when she heard Kermit's words, and then she turned her gaze to Roan beside her. Roan didn't waste any words and said directly, "Give me all the relevant documents, phone records, and all other details of this transaction. Now." "That's impossible." "Okay." Kermit heard this and shook his head repeatedly. "I have to deal with hundreds of stock transactions every day. Is it possible to find all the information about that transaction so quickly? How about this? I'll send it to you after get off work today." "Okay." "No. If I say you can, you can." Before Kermit finished speaking, Roan waved his hand to interrupt him, then stared into his eyes and said seriously, "Listen, Kermit, you are just a junior trader working in a small economic investment company. I'm sure that the $20 million transaction is definitely the largest transaction you have ever seen, and the commission on that transaction must have made you a lot of money. So, don't try to tell us such a lie that can be easily exposed. Deceiving the FBI is a felony." Kermit heard this, his face suddenly darkened, and after a cold snort, he strode out of the lounge. "I'll find the file now." "Good." Roan looked at Kermit's back and nodded with satisfaction. A moment later, Lassie sat in the passenger seat of the SUV with a few papers. Roan reached out and opened the door of the driver's seat of the SUV, took out his cell phone and called Mona. "Mona, I have a cell phone number here. Can you help me check it?" Unlike the past, this time Mona did not agree immediately, but asked Roan a question. "Roan, do you remember Brentu's laptop that Ryder brought back from the trace examination department?" "Yeah." Sitting in the driver's seat, Roan fastened his seatbelt and nodded. "Of course I remember. What, did you find anything in the computer?" "Yes. After Brentu's computer came into my hands, I first looked through his browsing history and found a lot of interesting things." Mona in the office area of the number 5 investigation team had a serious face, and Roan, who started the SUV, had a series of black lines on his forehead. He thought of the news he saw in his previous life about a person who did not forget to format his phone before he died. Sure enough, the existence of invisible browsing is necessary. Wait. Thinking of this, Luo An's eyebrows jumped. Can invisible browsing prevent computer experts like Mona? Mona didn't know the messy thoughts in Luo An's mind. She continued to talk to the phone. Brentu scanned his computer for viruses a few days ago with the help of a computer expert in a forum on the internet. As a result, a virus was really found. Luo An's face suddenly became solemn when he heard this, and he asked in a deep voice, "What virus?" If it was just a small virus, Mona would not have told him about it. "A very special virus." Mona on the other end of the phone explained, "The program of this virus is not complicated. It just scans the files in Brentu's laptop for keywords. There are many keywords, most of which are related to stock trading. After searching for the target content, the virus will send those information in the form of emails." Wow. Hearing Mona's description, Luo An's eyebrows immediately raised. "It feels like a movie." After tilting his head and thinking for a few seconds, Luo An asked, "Can you find out who received the email?" Mona in the office of the number 5 investigation team looked unhappy. "The other party used a virtual machine and a temporary mailbox. If you want to investigate carefully, it will take a long time." Mona judged that it would take at least 2 nights. "Okay." Hearing Mona's words, Luo An hurriedly asked her to put aside the investigation of the email recipient and asked her to check the phone number just now. "Okay." Checking the phone number was simple. Mona quickly found out the identity of the woman on the other end of the phone. Una Ramirez, 49 years old, is one of the agents of the Dancer Model Company and currently lives in Queens. Dancer Model Company? Hearing Mona's words on the phone, Lassie, who was sitting in the co-pilot, suddenly brightened up. Seeing this, Luo An hurriedly tilted his head and asked, "What's wrong?" "This modeling company is very famous in the underground of New York." Lassie tilted her head to look at Luo An, with a strange light in her eyes, and her tone was very special. The models there have all practiced a skill very well. Seeing the expression on Lassie's face and hearing her words, Luo An suddenly fell silent. He planned to let Lassie take him to see it after the case was over. He was still young and had never seen skills, so he needed to broaden his horizons. Thank you for your hard work. After getting the address of Una Ramirez from Mona, Luo An stepped on the accelerator to the bottom, and the SUV instantly drove out in the direction of the highway. By the way, Mona. Just as Mona was about to hang up, Roan suddenly thought of something, so he raised his eyebrows and asked in confusion, "Can you find out the time when the virus entered Brentu's computer?" Mona was stunned. "What do you mean?" "If we can find out the time when the virus entered the computer," Roan said with a smile, while driving the car, "then we can find out Brentu's schedule for the day." Then, Mona, who was in the office area of the number 5 investigation team, heard this and suddenly understood it, and her eyes lit up instantly. "Then I can know who transferred the virus into Brentu's computer." "That's right." Roan nodded with a smile on his face. Mona is a computer expert. When she encounters a problem, she habitually uses hacker methods to solve it. Roan only has some basic understanding of computers, but he can reason, so it is easy to find problems that Mona overlooked. Not long after, Mona's happy cheer came from the other end of the phone. "Thank you so much, Luo An. You helped me solve a big problem that kept me up all night tonight." Luo An raised his eyebrows and asked, "What did you find?" "The virus appeared in Brentu's computer at dawn half a month ago," Mona said to the phone with a smile on her face. "According to Brentu's credit card records, Brentu's was resting in a hotel at that time. The hotel surveillance video shows that Brentu's was not alone. He was accompanied by a Western European model named Philomena. I know Philomena." Hearing Mona's words, Lassie, who had been silent, suddenly covered her mouth and exclaimed, "As far as I know, she is also a model under the Dancer Model Company, and she is one of the best." "Okay." Hearing this, Luo An's face suddenly showed a smile. He has connected the whole thing. Chapter 150 to the Insider Eyes. Hearing Mona's words, and Lassie's introduction of Philomena and the Dancer Model Company, and thinking about the miracle of capitalism that he had found before, Luo An quickly figured out the truth about Brentu's death. Because Brentu's job was mainly responsible for mergers and acquisitions between companies, some guys who wanted to make quick money targeted him. The mastermind first sent Philomena to approach Brentu's half a month or even longer ago. Brentu's had been divorced for a long time, so he was very successful. He couldn't resist the temptation of the beautiful model and invited the other party to exchange body fluids. But Philomena was not interested in Brentu's himself, but the files in his computer. So after the exercise, Brentu's fell asleep, and Philomena put the virus into Brentu's laptop in the early morning. The main program of the virus is to scan the keywords of documents and other information in the computer, and then send the content in the form of emails. So the mastermind quickly learned the inside information of a company on Wall Street. After getting the inside information, the mastermind decisively used the shell company to set up a new shell company, namely SDAM. Then SDAM spent $20 million to buy the stock of that company. The next day, SDAM successfully sold the stock at a price of $42 million, a net profit of $20 million overnight. Robbing money is not so fast. But Brentu's, who has worked in Wall Street for so long, found that something was wrong with the deal. Then, Brentu's immediately looked for a computer expert to search his computer and successfully found the virus. Thinking back to who he had contacted recently, Brentu's instantly realized that it was Philomena who did it, and immediately contacted Wells, an attorney at the Securities and Exchange Commission. The mastermind who had been monitoring Brentu's, after learning the news, immediately had Brentu's head smashed. Thinking of this, Roan did not hesitate, and quickly asked Riyadh to arrest Una Ramirez of the Dancer Model Agency. After confirming that Ryder had taken his equipment and was about to start the operation, Roan continued to ask on the phone, "Mona, where is Philomena now?" Throughout the case, Una Ramirez was responsible for controlling Kermit's purchase and sale of stocks by phone, while Philomena was the specific executor close to Brentu's. So it is known that both of them have a high probability of knowing the true identity of the mastermind behind the scenes. Hearing Roan's question, Mona in the office area of the 5th investigation team immediately started typing on the keyboard. After a while, Mona's somewhat strange voice came from the other end of the phone. It shows here that Philomena is now in the NYPD police station. Hearing this, Roan and Lassie were stunned. NYPD police station. When Roan and Lassie arrived here, a white woman with a curvy figure and a beautiful face was arguing loudly with the female police officer in the police station with an anxious face. "Hi, Lassie. Why are you here?" As soon as the two of them stepped into the police station, before Luo An could react, several white female police officers' eyes lit up and quickly came to Lassie's side. While asking Lassie why she came here, two of the female police officers kissed Lassie on the face without any concealment in front of the other female police officers. Seeing that Lassie was facing so many boats at the same time, she was still calm and did not look like she was overturned at all. Luo An was speechless and his eyes narrowed slightly. Luo An never minded learning more about knowledge that he did not understand. Who knows if there will be a chance to use it in the future. It is always better to be prepared. Ahem. After chatting with a few female police officers, Lassie tilted her head and pointed to the place where the quarrel was going on and asked in a low voice, "What's going on over there?" The female model came to report that her sister was missing, and she said that she was in danger now and wanted us to help find her quickly. A female police officer with a few freckles on her face hugged Lassie's waist and explained in a low voice, "But according to the information provided by the female model, we didn't find the sister," she said, "at all. The other party doesn't exist at all, so of course we can't help her find." Lassie frowned and cast her eyes on Roan. Roan, who also heard the news, did not change his expression. Just as he was about to speak, the phone in his pocket suddenly rang. He took out his phone and walked aside, pressed the answer button, and immediately heard Riyad's solemn words on the other end of the phone. "Roan, bad news. Una Ramirez is dead." According to Riyad's description, when he arrived at Una Ramirez's house with several SWAT team members, he found Una Ramirez's body in the kitchen. The body was shot in the side of the brain and died on the spot, just like Brentu's. The exact time of death is unknown, but it looks like it was not long ago. Ryder has called the trace examination department to check there. "Thank you for your hard work." After listening to Ryder's narration, Roan nodded gloomily, and after a few simple words, he hung up the phone. Seeing Roan's unhappy face, Lassie hurried over and whispered, "What happened?" Hearing the news that Ryder had just passed on from Roan, Lassie's face instantly turned ugly. The speed of the mastermind to kill the witness was faster than she thought. But Roan was not panicked, because there was another insider in front of him. Walking towards the female model not far away, Roan took out the golden badge and said seriously, "FBI, we have something to ask you." "FBI?" Hearing Roan's voice, Philomena, who was arguing with the female police officer with an angry face, was stunned at first, and then a flash of panic flashed in her eyes. But Philomena's years of modeling experience still made her react. She hurriedly kept her face unchanged and asked with her head tilted in confusion, "What do you want to see me for?" Roan didn't waste any words and directly told her the news of Brentu's death. "What did you say?" Hearing this, Philomena immediately covered her mouth and exclaimed, and her expression became flustered. Roan carefully observed Philomena's movements and found that her reaction did not seem to be fake. A lot of ideas flashed through her mind, but she continued expressionlessly. "We found that the cause of Brentu's death may be related to you. Come with us now." "No." Philomena shook her head repeatedly and refused loudly. "My sister is missing now. She is in danger now. You must find her, otherwise I will not go anywhere." "Are you sure?" Roan narrowed his eyes and continued, "Una Ramirez is also dead, just now." Hearing Roan's words, Philomena froze in place, and a trace of fear appeared in her eyes. After keeping silent for a while, Philomena raised her head and looked at Luo An, her face pale as she said, "You FBI must help me find my sister, otherwise I will never leave the NYPD." Luo An's expression remained unchanged, but a trace of doubt flashed through his heart. He had a guess just now, that is, Philomena was afraid of being silenced, so she fabricated a sister to take refuge in the police station. but now this guess can be thrown into the trash can. The sister that Philomena mentioned seems to have another hidden story. Chapter 153, Serial Murder Case in the Deep Pit at the Seaside. Investigation Team Number 5, Interrogation Room. Philomena's hands were handcuffed on the interrogation table, and Roan and Lassie sat opposite her. After briefly organizing the information, Roan handed over a part that could be shown to others to Philomena, and said, "If you can get tomorrow's Wall Street Journal today, you will definitely not lose money." After briefly describing the case, Roan finally asked in a deep voice, "Tell me, who is the mastermind behind this case?" After hearing Roan's words, Philomena was very shocked and looked at Roan with disbelief. She never expected that the FBI would find out the truth behind Brentu's death so quickly. Looking up, Philomena looked deeply at the handsome FBI agent in front of her. After taking a deep breath, she still shook her head and said, "I won't say anything until you find my sister." Luo An frowned when he heard this and pulled Lassie beside him and said in a low voice, "I have asked the best agent of our number 5 investigation team to find your sister based on the information you provided. But the premise is that the information you provide must be true." Philomena slapped the table with excitement. "Of course the information I provided is true. I didn't lie to you." "Okay." Luo An did not dwell on this point, but continued, "Philomena, I didn't lie to you either. My colleagues are indeed looking for your sister in the federal database. We now have a basis for cooperation, so can you tell us about the case?" Hearing Luo An's words, Philomena lowered her head and remained silent for a while, and finally whispered with a bitter face, "I really didn't kill Brentus, I swear. I just did what others asked me to do." Lassie asked doubtfully, "What do you mean?" After taking a deep look at Roan, Philomena took a deep breath and said, "When I was 18, I was still a country girl. Once, a photographer in our country told me that I could make a lot of money by being a model in New York. Then they helped me get a visa, bought a plane ticket, and sent me to New York. But it was all a lie." Roan frowned and tilted his head to look at Lassie, who also tilted her head to look at him with an ugly face. The two of them could already guess what would happen next. Sure enough, Philomena continued with red eyes. "He told me that if I didn't do what he said, he would kill me first and then kill my family in our country. Then he beat me and made me stronger." Roan sighed. Lassie frowned. Her face was ugly, but she whispered softly, "Who is he?" "He is the one who ordered me to approach Brentus, and the one who ordered Brentus to be killed." Philomena shook her head and said again that she would not reveal the man's name until her sister was found. For Philomena, this was her only bargaining chip. Roan and Lassie also thought of this, so they didn't force it. Philomena continued to whisper with red eyes. "Later, because of my good appearance, he sent me to the dancer model company and let me learn under Una Ramirez. After a while, he began to take me to the places where people on Wall Street eat, drink and have fun. While introducing me and helping me to make a name for myself, he also sent me to sleep with some people." A few minutes later, Philomena finished her narration. Roan and Lassie looked at each other and stood up and left the interrogation room together. Dirty Wall Street. As soon as she walked out of the interrogation room, Lassie spat with an unhappy face, then tilted her head to look at Roan. "Is this why you chose to leave Wall Street?" Roan was slightly stunned when he heard this, and then nodded. Lassie had an "I knew it" expression on her face, patted Luo An's shoulder hard, and said in a deep voice, "I only knew that Wall Street was dirty before, but I didn't expect it to be this dirty. In fact, you haven't seen the dirtier places yet." Looking at Lassie's back as she walked towards the office area, Luo An shook his head silently. Betrayal, double dealing, breaking one's promise, kicking someone when they are down, sweet words and treacherous hearts. There are countless examples of Wall Street people doing whatever it takes to make money. The darkest and ugliest things that humans can think of have basically happened here. How is it, Mona? Walking to the office area of investigation team number 5, Roan sat down on his chair, stretched, tilted his head to look at Mona, and asked with a smile, "Have you found any information about the sister that Philomena mentioned?" "Of course. I'm Mona." Hearing Roan's question, Mona threw him a pair of sanitary balls, then pointed to the information in the computer and said, "The information Philomena mentioned is actually the information of his sister in Europe. It is normal that NYPD can't find it. I just used the FBI internal network to jump into the internal network of the Customs and Immigration Administration and successfully found a girl who matched the appearance and information described by Philomena. Well done." Smilingly pouring Mona a cup of coffee, Roan cast his eyes on her computer screen and found that there was actually a case record inside. Luo An's heart suddenly skipped a beat and he asked hurriedly, "What's going on?" "A serial murder case discovered by the NYPD the night before yesterday." Mona borrowed the coffee that Luo An poured for her, raised her head, and drank it in one gulp, then said angrily, "At 10:40 p.m. the night before yesterday, the NYPD received a report from a worker who was working overtime to repair the road. He said that they found a girl covered in blood and dying on the beach on the south side of Long Island. After sending the girl to the hospital, the NYPD found a deep pit that was flooded with seawater in a remote corner of the beach, based on the blood dripping from the girl on the ground. After draining the water from the deep pit, the NYPD found 22 female bodies at the bottom of the pit." "What did you say?" Lassie's pupils dilated instantly, and she hurried over. 22 female bodies? Lassie's voice was a little distorted because of excitement. "That's right." Mona was also very angry. She pointed at the information in the computer, her eyes full of anger, and after forensic identification, these 22 women are all under 25 years old. The youngest is even just 17 years old, and not yet an adult. Bang! Hearing Mona's words, Lassie slammed the table hard and cursed, "Fouquet. Damn murderer, son of bitch." Luo An's face was also not good, but he still did not forget the original goal, and hurriedly asked, "What about Philomena's sister? If the girl I found is really Philomena's sister." Mona tapped on the keyboard with her 10 fingers, and a portrait photo appeared in front of the two. "Then she is the body of the girl numbered 021. Hearing this, Lassie immediately raised her hands to cover her eyes, and Luo An also let out a long breath of turbid air. The air was quiet for a long time. Lassie and Mona looked at each other, and finally turned their eyes to carefully examine the case. Luo An, who was silent, asked in a low voice, "What should we do next?" Chapter 154, Jumping off the balcony and risking one's life, the true murderer's identity. Office area of the 5th investigation team. After a moment's silence, Luo An signaled Mona to print out the information and photos of the girl in the computer. He was going to give it to Philomena and ask if the girl was the sister that Philomena was looking for. If she was not a sister, there was no need to tell Philomena about this case, and Mona could continue investigating. If it was really. Seeing the eyes of Lassie and Mona, Luo An said expressionlessly, "The news of the girl's death must be told to Philomena. After all, she is the girl's relative." The information in the computer showed that no one had claimed the girl's body until now. Even if it was for the girl's funeral, they should tell Philomena this news. A few minutes later, Mona prepared the girl's information and photos, and Luo An took the folder and tilted his head to look at Lassie. Lassie patted her cheek, stood up and walked into the interrogation room with Luo An. The girl is indeed Philomena's sister. After learning about her sister's death, Philomena sat in a chair in a daze for a long time, and finally covered her eyes with her hands, lowered her head and cried silently, "It's all my fault." Hearing Philomena's words, Lassie hurriedly comforted her. After Philomena's emotions stabilized, she took out a piece of paper and handed it to her, then asked in a low voice, "Philomena, what happened?" Roan was also a little confused about Philomena's reaction. He just guessed that Philomena might subconsciously deny the matter after learning about her sister's death. Yelling and even refusing to say who was behind the murder of Brentus was also in his preparation. Roan had also thought of a solution to this situation in advance, but unexpectedly, Philomena seemed to have guessed the possibility that her sister had died, and she also blamed herself for all this. "It's all my fault." Hearing Lassie's question, Philomena was silent for a while, repeated this sentence first, and then whispered, "After I helped him make some money, his attitude towards me became much better. One night a long time ago, after he had done all the hard work on me, I took the opportunity to propose the idea of sending some of my share of the money back to my family. Not only did he agree, he also allowed me to sit in front of him and chat with my parents on the phone. At this point, Philomena's expression was extremely complicated. Hearing the man's words, Philomena was very happy. She hadn't called her parents for a long time and could only contact them by text message every time. Because the man was sitting in front of Philomena, Philomena didn't dare to tell her experience on the phone. She could only tell her parents that she was living a good life now, with good food, clothing, housing and transportation, and she also made a lot of money, so she sent some money back to subsidize the family. But what Philomena didn't expect was that her cousin, who had just turned 18, happened to be a guest at her house that night. When she heard her cousin say that she was a model in New York and her life was colorful, she immediately thought of going to her cousin. How could Philomena let her cousin jump into the fire pit? So she hung up the phone in a hurry. But I didn't expect that she would still come to New York. Philomena covered her cheeks with both hands and said in a trembling voice, 3 days ago, a strange phone call suddenly came to my mobile phone. After I picked up the phone, I found that it was my cousin who called. The cousin on the other end of the phone was very anxious and told Philomena that she had come to New York but was deceived and was now forced to sell drugs. This phone was taken from the prostitute by her when the prostitute and a good sister were doing exercise, and she ran to the bathroom to call Philomena. The cousin on the other end of the phone wanted Philomena to save her, but before Philomena asked where her cousin was, a man suddenly shouted and scolded her on the phone, and then the other end hung up the phone. Philomena was very panicked and wanted to save people very anxiously, but she didn't know where her cousin was, so she couldn't call the police. She couldn't leave because there were always surveillance personnel sent by the man around her. Until today, Philomena finally took advantage of an old man from Wall Street taking a shower and jumped off the balcony to escape the surveillance personnel and ran to the NYPD police station. After listening to Philomena's narration, Lassie looked solemn and felt very complicated deep in her heart. 3 days ago, Luo An, who was sitting next to her, didn't look very good either, but he found a key point. The female corpse in the deep pit at the seaside was found the day before yesterday, and Philomena's cousin called 3 days ago. The body number was still ranked 21 out of 22. Roan rested his chin on his hand and whispered to himself, cousin Philomena should have been killed by the murderer shortly after she made the call. But Roan did not tell Philomena this guess because he now had an important question to ask. Philomena, who is that man you mentioned? What's his name? His name is Salvatore Cristo. Hearing Roan's question, Philomena did not hesitate. She immediately raised her head and said with gritted teeth, his father is an immigrant from Europe, and he himself has connections with many European gangs in New York. And Salvatore Cristo's official identity is the owner of a high-end jewelry store for rent. Okay. After getting the identity of the mastermind behind the murder of Brentus, Roan nodded decisively and stood up to leave the interrogation room. As soon as the door opened, Philomena looked at Roan's back and pleaded loudly, Agent Roan, I beg you, help me catch the murderer who killed my cousin. Roan paused and did not answer, but still walked out of the interrogation room quickly. Seeing this, Philomena's body shook, her face turned pale, and then she quickly turned her eyes to Lassie. Philomena didn't know much about the speed of the FBI's case handling, but this group of agents in front of her could solve Brentu's case so quickly, and Philomena believed that they would be able to quickly find the murderer who killed her cousin. Seeing Philomena's eyes, Lassie's eyebrows trembled, but she also did not agree. Although Lassie sympathized with the experience of Philomena and her sister, she could not take up the case just because she wanted to. Lassie asked herself that she was not at this level in the number 5 investigation team. The only two people who had the power to choose whether to take over the case in the number 5 investigation team, besides the team leader Augustus, were Roan. Augustus is the team leader, so he naturally has the power. Roan is the specific leader of the case, who can not only solve the case, but also lead everyone to earn bonuses. Although the detectives of the number 5 investigation team did not say it, they actually ranked Roan as a deputy team leader in their hearts. So Roan naturally has the power to decide whether to take on the case. Thinking of this, Lassie pretended not to see the pleading look in Philomena's red eyes and followed Roan out of the interrogation room. Mona. After walking out of the interrogation room, Roan didn't waste any words and immediately asked Mona to investigate the current location of Salvato Cristo and then asked Lassie to apply for a search warrant. Okay. Hearing Roan's words, Mona immediately nodded in agreement and her 10 fingers also flew on the keyboard. Lassie put the document back on her workstation and prepared to leave the office to apply for a search warrant, but after hesitating for a few seconds, she tilted her head to look at Luo An and asked in a low voice, "Luo An, what do you think about the serial murder case on the beach?" Mona, who was standing by, paused typing on the keyboard when she heard this and also turned around to look at Luo An. Chapter 155 How tight is very tight? Seeing the pleading look in Mona and Lassie's eyes, Luo An sat down on the chair with a serious face. "You need to know one thing." Picking up a folder from the desk, Luo An looked at the two women in front of him and said seriously, "That was a serial murder case." Hearing Luo An's words, Mona and Lassie were stunned at first, and then their faces fell after they reacted. Yes, it was a serial murder case. In the previous life in 2020, the murder case detection rate in the United States was only 54%. Among them, the detection rate of serial murder cases is not worth mentioning. Now it is still 2005, and the level of scientific and technological equipment is far less than that time. Lassie and Mona don't know the situation in the future, but they also know how difficult it is to solve a serial murder case. Every serial murder case that is solved is either on the New York News or in the FBI's internal textbooks. After the last lake bottom sinking case was solved, several news media in New York City sent interview requests to Luo An of the number 5 investigation team, wanting him to be on TV. But Luo An just wanted to make money quietly and didn't want to attract a group of crazy people because of his fame, so he rejected them. Even so, the case eventually attracted the attention of some people who manage case files within the FBI. This case is likely to be included in the textbooks of the FBI training academy in the future. It's just that the procedure is complicated, so it's unknown how long it will take. Everyone in the number 5 investigation team knew about this, and Mona and Lassie knew it too. But because Luo An has successfully solved cases many times recently, the case solving rate after Luo An joined the number 5 investigation team has magically increased to 100%. So Mona and Lassie would think of Luo An when they encountered a case. The two of them have subconsciously ignored the difficulty of serial murder cases, thinking that as long as Luo An takes action, there will be no case that cannot be solved. It was not until they heard Luo An's reminder that Mona and Lassie remembered that Luo An could not guarantee to solve every case. Sorry. After thinking about this, Lassie and Mona showed a hint of disappointment in their eyes, but they still expressed their apologies to Luo An. The two of them just subconsciously hoped that Roan would take over the case because they were both women and felt sympathy and indignation for Philomena's experience. No need to apologize. Roan waved his hand, took a sip of the coffee on the table, and raised his mouth slightly. "I'm going to talk to Augustus later, and then take over this serial murder case." Hearing this, Lassie, who was picking up her clothes and preparing to leave the office area to apply for a search warrant, turned her head in surprise. Mona, who was checking the information again, heard this and instantly typed several wrong letters, looking at Roan with a look of astonishment. Seeing the smile on Roan's face, Mona didn't understand that Roan was just teasing her, so she rolled her eyes and slapped Roan's arm hard. Roan, who was very happy to be teasing, laughed and handed the folder in his hand to the two of them. The information shows that the NYPD has not handed over this serial murder case to any FBI investigation team. In this way, there will be no problem of competing with other investigation teams for the case and eventually causing conflicts. Not only that, the body was found on the south side of Long Island, and the government had originally set up a development plan for that area. But now because of the serial murder case with 22 bodies there, the development plan was forced to stagnate. In a hurry, the government publicly offered a reward of $200,000 to catch the real murderer of this case. With Salvato Cristo's name and occupation, Mona quickly found his current location. After getting the exact location information, Roan and Reed, who were fully armed, did not hesitate, and immediately set out with a team of SWAT members to arrest Salvatore Cristo. Salvatore Cristo was at a private aircraft landing pad in the suburbs of New York. When Roan and Reed arrived, Salvatore was just about to board a small private plane. A SWAT member parked the car in front of the small private plane and blocked the plane's path. After Ryder and the other SWAT members waited for the car to stop, they immediately ran out of the car, raised their rifles, aimed at Salvatore Cristo and shouted, "Don't move." Salvatore Cristo, who was standing in the middle of the stairs of the private plane, looked extremely unhappy when he saw the fully armed SWAT members. As soon as he turned around, Roan also drove in SUV and blocked the back of the private plane. Walking to Salvatore Cristo, who was pointed at by Ryder's gun, Roan took out handcuffs and handcuffed him on the wrist and said expressionlessly, "Congratulations, Mr. Cristo, you don't have to take a plane for the next few decades." Salvatore Cristo's face turned pale when he heard this. The next day, investigation team number 5. Roan, this is a gift that Philomena asked me to bring to you. Early in the morning, Roan had just sat down in his chair when Lassie came over with a small box in her hand, smiling. Hearing what Lassie said, Roan, who was about to stretch, paused and asked with his head tilted, "Gift? What does it mean?" Literally. Putting the small box on Roan's desk, Lassie replied with a smile, "Salvatore Cristo has offended too many people and has many cases on his back. We just couldn't arrest him before because we had no evidence. After we arrested him this time, after discussion with the prosecutor, Philomena, as the most important witness, successfully joined the witness protection program. When this case is over, Philomena will change her name and identity and live out the rest of her life in anonymity in other cities in the Federation. She will also have the opportunity to bring her parents into the Federation. So to express her gratitude, Philomena specially prepared this gift for you." Opening the box on the table, I found a silver men's watch inside, which was very valuable. Luo An raised his eyebrows, thought for a moment, tilted his head and asked, "I plan to take over the serial murder case of her sister. Have you told Philomena?" "Of course not." Hearing Luo An's words, Lassie rolled her eyes. She is not a person who does not know the importance of things. Not to mention that the case has not been handed over to the 5th investigation team. Even if the case is really handed over to the 5th investigation team, as long as it involves the case itself, Lassie will not say anything. Lassie put her hands on her hips and smiled disdainfully. "I have always kept my mouth shut." "How tight is tight?" Luo An raised his eyebrows, then quickly shook his head and threw the messy thoughts in his mind aside. Picking up the silver watch and looking at it carefully, Luo An thought for a moment and slowly smiled on his face. After being a model for so many years and wandering around those old guys on Wall Street so many times, Philomena is still a little scheming. On the surface, this watch is a thank you gift from Philomena. But in fact, this watch was probably a request from Philomena for Luo An to take over the serial murder case in the deep pit by the sea. Luo An shook his head and put the watch back into the box. Just as he was about to stretch his waist, Augustus, who was bulging with a big belly, suddenly pushed the door of the number 5 investigation team and walked in. "Luo An, come to my office." "Luo An, if you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 156. Good things come late. Investigation team number 5, team leader's office. As soon as the two sat down, Augustus handed a folder to Luo An, grinning and saying, "Luo An, you solved the Brentu's case so beautifully." With a slight curl of his lips, Luo An gave Augustus a smile that showed his great achievements, and then he lowered his head and opened the folder in his hand. The content on the paper in the folder was not what Luo An had imagined, a new bonus payment certificate. It was a notice that the Seaside Deep Pit serial murder case was transferred to their investigation team number 5. Luo An raised his eyebrows and looked up at Augustus, who was sitting opposite him and drinking a cup of coffee. although Augustus successfully got the case, which made Luo An feel good. But in the past, after the case was solved, the bonus payment certificate would basically be issued the next day. Luo An had even received several double bonuses before. What happened this time? Salvato Cristo is a bit troublesome. Seeing Roan's eyes, Augustus understood instantly, put the coffee cup on the desk, and said with a smile, in addition to Philomena, he has several women who are in contact with people on Wall Street. After you and Riyad arrested Salvato yesterday, a team leader of the Financial Crime Investigation Department contacted me. The team leader of an investigation team of the Financial Crime Investigation Department asked Augustus not to prosecute Salvato for the time being, because they also have many cases related to Salvato and Wall Street, but they have never had evidence before. Now that the number 5 investigation team has not only arrested Salvato, but also has Philomena as a witness, the Financial Crime Investigation Department intends to use this to completely put Salvato in prison for the rest of his life. At this point, Augustus looked at Roan with more and more satisfaction. Most of the cases handled by the Financial Crime Investigation Department are related to Wall Street, and every time a case is solved, they can make a lot of money from it. So sometimes this group of people look down on the Criminal Investigation Division, the Organized Crime Investigation Division, etc. These investigation teams need to run field work frequently, have low salaries and small bonuses. In addition, the number 5 investigation team was established not long ago, and Augustus is a new team leader transferred from another department. On weekdays, although the team leaders of the Financial Crime Investigation Division will not ridicule Augustus, their attitude towards Augustus is also very general. And this time, because Luo An solved the Park River Male Corpse case and caught the mastermind behind it, Salvato Cristo, the team leader of the Financial Crime Investigation Division, had to come to Augustus for cooperation. Thinking of the expression on the face of the team leader of the Financial Crime Investigation Division, Augustus laughed out his back teeth. Patting his belly, Augustus felt that Luo An had the demeanor of his youth. He raised his eyebrows to Luo An. After the Salvato case is completely over, the Financial Crime Investigation Department will express their gratitude to our investigation team number 5. Hearing this, Luo An understood instantly and smiled. I understand. Thank you, sir. Good food is never too late. It's just a little bonus. Luo An is not in a hurry. Moreover, judging from Augustus's attitude, the gratitude from the Financial Crime Investigation Department afterwards seems to be more than just a bonus. Waving his hand, Augustus said that Luo An solved the case, and he had the greatest contribution. There was no need to thank him for such a small thing. Sitting on the chair, after briefly chatting about the details of the Park River Male Corpse case, the two finally left the team leader's office together. Good morning, detectives, gentlemen, and ladies. Walking to the front of the investigation team's office area, Augustus looked around and found that everyone was there. He loudly said that the follow-up processing of the Park River Male Corpse case could be put aside for the time being. Shaking the folder in his hand, Augustus continued, what we are going to deal with next is a serial murder case against girls. Hearing that the number 5 investigation team had indeed taken over the Seaside Deep Pit serial murder case, Lassie and Mona immediately cast grateful eyes on Roan. Roan grinned and waved his hand to signal the two to listen carefully to William's description of the specific circumstances of the case. The course and situation of the case described by William were exactly the same as what Mona had investigated before. The night before yesterday, workers who were working overtime in Long Island found a girl covered in blood. Based on the bloodstains on the ground, the NYPD found the deep pit where the murderer disposed of the bodies and found 22 female bodies in the deep pit. Thank you, William. After listening to the case, Augustus waved his hand to signal William to sit down, then looked at everyone and said, it is obvious that what we are looking for this time is a cruel and ruthless pervert. Does anyone have any ideas or experience in finding perverts? I checked the location where the body was found. Mona sat at her workstation, tapped the keyboard a few times, showed the photos inside to everyone, and answered seriously, the location is in a very remote place in the southern part of Long Island. If it weren't for the government building a road to develop that area, and the surviving girl was lucky to escape, the deep pit would probably not be discovered for decades. The photos on the computer showed that the location of the deep pit was right by the sea, and because of the backflow of seawater, the entire deep pit was full of turbid seawater. The first thing ordinary people saw when they saw the deep pit was definitely to turn around and avoid it. Children or a few men who happened to pass by here might pick up a few stones and throw them down to test the depth. Okay. After hearing Mona's words, Augustus frowned and his tone was quite solemn. To be able to choose such a remote place, the murderer must know the place very well. Yeah. The detectives nodded in unison. The murderer had dealt with 22 bodies in the deep pit, so he must be very familiar with the area. There is no surveillance in that area yet. After taking a look at the map data in Mona's computer, Augustus touched his chin and finally tilted his head to look at Roan. Roan, what do you think? The girl who survived was too seriously injured, and the surgery on her body could not be completed at one time, so she is still undergoing surgery today. Hearing Augustus' question, Roan didn't waste any words and pointed directly at the data in the computer and said, on the other hand, because there are too many bodies in this case, the NYPD has not yet issued a complete autopsy report. There is no rush for the girl. I plan to take a look at the 22 bodies first. Maybe I can find some clues related to the murderer. Good. Augustus nodded with satisfaction, and after a few simple instructions, he handed over the leadership of this case to Roan. Because Roan solved the bombing case, the new funds issued by Corbett arrived this morning, and Augustus needs to go and receive it now. This money is related to the new coffee machine, new chairs and new computers of the number 5 investigation team in the future, so there must be no problems. By the way, Mona. When preparing to leave with Lassie, Luo An suddenly slapped his head and tilted his head to Mona and said, remember Philomena mentioned before that her sister used the client's phone to call her for help. Chapter 157 Breast Augmentation Surgery. Of course. Mona nodded, instantly understanding what Roan meant, and immediately stood up and said, I'll check Philomena's phone and find out who's behind that phone number. As a prostitute, the man had definitely contacted people related to the case. Good. Seeing that Mona understood his idea so quickly, Roan smiled and walked towards the elevator with Lassie. The elevator slowly descended, and Lassie glanced at Roan, who was thinking with his head down, and suddenly a strange light flashed in her eyes. She just thought carefully about Mona's performance in the past few days, and found that not only was Mona's speed of guessing Roan's thoughts getting faster and faster, but Mona's occasional small movements in life and work were also increasingly similar to Roan's shadow. NYPD, autopsy room. Good morning, FBI agent. Good morning, Mr. Forensic Doctor, just call me Roan. Roan was no stranger to the old white forensic doctor in front of him. In the previous car accident case caused by the CIA, when Roan and Mona came to investigate Evander's body, they met this old medical examiner. The CIA agent also stole Evander's computer, while the old medical examiner was obsessed with dissecting the body. Okay, Roan. After all, he had met Roan once before, so the old medical examiner didn't waste words this time. He picked up a cup of coffee and drank it, then said with a smile, my name is Latham. Thank you for your hard work, Latham. Glancing at the covered female corpse, Roan chose to ignore the coffee next to him and asked in a deep voice, can you tell me about the situation of these bodies? Of course. The old medical examiner nodded and then took out a fast food noodle in a square paper shell from the cabinet next to him. But before that, I need to eat something first. The old medical examiner said that he was old, and this time 22 bodies came at once. Although he had colleagues to help, he was still very busy these days. Smelling the faint smell of corpse in the air, and seeing the old forensic doctor sitting next to the corpse and eating calmly, Lassie's mouth twitched, and then she looked away. Over the years in the FBI's trace examination department, Lassie had seen such scenes many times. But seeing it many times does not mean that she has completely adapted to it. Although Lassie no longer feels nauseous, she still feels very uncomfortable. Luo An didn't care. Not only did he not change his expression, he even asked the old forensic doctor where he bought the fast food noodles. It smelled good, so he turned around and wanted to try it. Seeing this, the old forensic doctor immediately cast a satisfied look at Luo An. He has been in the forensic industry for a lifetime. Seeing himself eating in front of a corpse, most people, except for forensic colleagues, would feel nauseous and vomit and choose to leave the room. A small number of people would be like Lassie, accustomed to it, but still not adapted, and choose to quietly look away. And people like Luo An, who are not forensic doctors and do not often come into contact with disemboweled corpses in their own work, but still remain calm when facing himself eating, are a minority among the minority. I'll give you the address later. After finishing the noodles in the box, the old forensic doctor wiped his mouth, and then he introduced Luo An, the agent who satisfied him, with a serious attitude several times more than usual. These victims were killed in the past 3 years. The most recent victims, number 018 and 019, died a week ago, and number 020, 021, and 022 died 3 days ago. Hearing this, Luo An's eyes narrowed slightly. The body number 021 was Philomena's sister. He had previously guessed that the other party was ruthlessly killed by the murderer after making the call for help. Now it seems that he was indeed right. The bodies of these victims were stabbed 15 to 25 times by the murderer with a serrated dagger. Lifting the blue cloth covering the bodies, the old forensic doctor pointed to the area above the breasts and said seriously, all of these bodies showed the characteristics of gang-related workers. Above their chests, all of them had a piece of skin the size of a bottle cap that had been cut off by the murderer. Looking at the cut skin on the bodies, Lass's face turned grim, and Luo An lowered his head to examine it carefully. After a moment, Luo An suddenly found that there were some bumpy marks on the flesh under the skin. He immediately looked up and asked, "What is this?" "Good eyesight." The old forensic doctor smiled and patted Luo An on the shoulder, explaining, "Obviously, this is a mark that can identify the identity of the victim." Luo An heard this, nodded after a long silence, and whispered, "And it was forcibly engraved on the victim with a heated blade." "What?" Hearing this, Lassie on the side was immediately puzzled. "Why is it engraved with a heated blade? Isn't it a direct branding?" "No." Luo An shook his head, turned around and explained seriously, "The heat emitted by the brand is limited, and it is impossible to penetrate the skin and enter the flesh so deep. Only a heated blade can achieve this degree." After speaking, Luo An turned his head to look at the old forensic doctor and continued to ask, "There are a total of 22 bodies. Which body has clearer marks? Or, can you restore the original appearance of the marks?" Combined with the cousin's call for help described by Philomena before, the corpses now show the characteristics of anti-heroes and the same brand marks on the corpses. It is not difficult to judge that all the victims should serve the same organization. The murderer removed the brand marks on the corpses just to make people wonder which organization this organization is. Faced with this situation, the real murderer behind this case, in addition to being a serial killer, may also be a human trafficker. As long as the original shape of the brand can be restored, with the help of the Organized Crime Investigation Department, Luo An believes that they will soon be able to find out where the organization's territory is and who is behind it. Then destroy this organization, catch the mastermind, and rescue the remaining girls at the same time. Lassie on the side thought carefully for a moment, and thought of this, and immediately cast a hopeful look at the old forensic doctor. Seeing this, the old medical examiner shook his head with a serious face. "The body is very decayed, and it has been sinking to the bottom of the sea for a long time. We can't restore the original appearance of the brand." "Okay." Luo An was a little disappointed when he heard this, but his expression did not change much, while Lass's face fell instantly. The greater the hope, the greater the disappointment. One more thing. Seeing Luo An's calm expression, the old medical examiner added a label of calmness and stability to him in his heart. After nodding with satisfaction, he continued, "Several girls over the age of 18 here have had polyacrylamide implant surgery." Lassie was slightly stunned when she heard this. Breast augmentation surgery? Luo An paid attention to the key point, looked at the old medical examiner with a serious face and asked, "Polyacrylamide? Are you sure?" In the previous life, breast augmentation through injection of polyacrylamide has been strictly prohibited because it is extremely harmful to the human body. At this point in time, most areas in the Federation have stopped using this material. Chapter 158, Simple Folk Customs, Harmony and Love. Of course I'm sure. Seeing the expression on Luo An's face, the old medical examiner laughed, put the blue cover back on the body, and continued, as far as I know, all regular hospitals in New York State no longer use polyacrylamide as a material for breast augmentation surgery on women. Lassie, who was standing by, heard this and asked, you mean, the only ones who still use this material are those underground black clinics? That's right. After getting the affirmative answer from the old medical examiner, Lassie blinked and turned to look at Luo An. Seeing Lassie's eyes, Luo An shook his head helplessly. There are too many underground clinics in New York. The city of New York has always been known for its simple folk customs, harmony and love. Citizens have also developed a good habit of falling asleep with the sound of gunfire. If there are no gunshots one day, New York citizens will not be able to sleep well. However, when gunshots are heard, someone must be injured, and the injured need treatment. America is a country that adheres to the capitalist development path. If there is demand, it will naturally provide supply. Therefore, underground black clinics have sprung up like mushrooms in the underground world of New York, and are distributed in all districts. In order to thoroughly investigate these black clinics, neither the NYPD nor the FBI can do it except the eyes. Hearing Luo An shaking his head and saying that, Lassie frowned immediately. She also thought of this. Just as she was about to say something, Luo An suddenly looked up at the old medical examiner and asked, what do you think of the doctor who performed breast augmentation surgery on these girls? His techniques or skills? Techniques or skills? Hearing Luo An's question, the old medical examiner raised his eyebrows immediately. He really didn't think of this. With his hands folded in front of his chest and thinking carefully, the old forensic doctor finally said in a deep voice, when this doctor performed breast augmentation surgery, he used a multi-level repeated puncture injection method to diffuse the hydrogel in the breast tissue. Moreover, when injecting the hydrogel, there was no acute bleeding caused by the needle tip piercing small blood vessels, and there was no tearing caused by the injection gap being too deep or too shallow, resulting in bleeding. Sorry. Hearing a lot of professional terms coming out of the old forensic doctor's mouth, Lassie was at a loss, and hurriedly waved her hand and asked, can you just state the conclusion? The old forensic doctor rolled his eyes when he heard this, and Luo An, who was standing next to him, supported his chin and nodded thoughtfully. You mean, this doctor has a lot of experience in breast augmentation surgery, and is very likely an expert in this field. The old forensic doctor nodded with satisfaction, and then threw Lassie a look that said look at him. Lassie. At this moment, Lassie's cell phone suddenly rang. After pressing the answer button and chatting briefly, Lassie tilted her head and looked at Luo An. The surviving girl has completed the surgery and has just woken up. Are we going to question her now? Of course. Luo An nodded, chatted briefly with the old forensic doctor, and turned to leave the NYPD autopsy room. Hospital, corridor. Luo An walked towards the elevator, and Lassie, who was standing beside him, held a folder, and introduced the girl's relevant information as she walked. Janiel Skrodov, 21 years old, Ukrainian. In the fall of 3 years ago, she flew from Kyiv to Kennedy International Airport, and applied for a 2-year tourist visa. Ukrainian? Luo An raised his eyebrows, tilted his head and thought for a while, then continued to ask, does she have relatives in New York? No. Lassie shook her head, closed the folder in her hand, walked into the elevator with Luo An, and explained, Janiel's parents are Ukrainian, and other relatives are also Ukrainian. The information from the customs shows that Janel came to New York and lived in a hotel suite. But Mona just checked the check-in records of that hotel and Janel has never lived there. In fact, Janel completely lost contact the day after she arrived in New York. After listening to Lassie's narration, Luo An frowned. The elevator door opened, and he took Lassie to the girls' ward. Janelle, who was wrapped in bandages all over her body, was lying on the bed. When Ron and Lassie pushed open the door and entered the room, she was crying silently. After a quick look at Janelle, Ron found that she was indeed a beauty that met European aesthetics. He took out the FBI's golden badge from his pocket and said, hello, Janelle, we are the FBI. Can you ask a few questions? FBI? Janelle was slightly stunned and subconsciously wanted to wipe the tears from the corners of her eyes, but her hands were all injured and she couldn't move at all. Seeing this, Lassie hurriedly took out a few pieces of paper from the side and gently helped Janelle wipe them clean. "Thank you." Janelle cast a grateful look at Lassie, thanked her in a hoarse voice, and then turned to look at Roan. "Is your FBI responsible for investigating this case? I beg you, you must catch them. There are many girls like me there. Of course, that's why we are here." Roan tilted his head to look at Lassie, and Lassie immediately took out a small notebook from her pocket to record the key information that might be useful later. After getting Roan's affirmative answer, Janelle didn't waste any words and immediately narrated the whole incident. At the age of 18, Janelle saw an advertisement of a modeling company in a newspaper in the countryside of Ukraine, saying that they could take them to New York to be models and make a lot of money. For becoming a model, young girls without much social experience always have a dream, so Janelle didn't hesitate for too long and called the number in the newspaper. In a company in Kyiv, after passing a simple physical fitness test and an identity information investigation, Janelle successfully boarded a plane to New York. Sitting on the plane, Janelle thought this was her first step towards success in life, but unexpectedly, this was actually her last train to hell. When I first arrived in New York, a man named John came to pick me up at the airport. That day, John was very kind to me. He not only took me to visit the attractions in New York, but also took me to a restaurant to eat some delicious food. Speaking of this, Janelle's face was full of hatred and regret. That night, John handed me a glass of champagne, and I drank it without thinking. When I woke up the next day, I found myself lying in a basement with my limbs tightly handcuffed by iron chains. Soon, John came in and told me that if I dared to resist, he would kill me and my family. Then, he brought 2 other men to rape me for 3 whole days. Speaking of this, Janelle's face turned pale and she burst into tears. Lassie's face looked ugly when she heard this. While whispering to comfort her, she picked up the paper and wiped Janelle's tears again. Luo An's expression did not change when he saw this, but he shook his head deep in his heart. There is no free lunch in the world. Free is the most expensive. This sentence applies everywhere. After a few minutes, Janelle's mood stabilized. Lassie saw this and comforted her briefly, then asked in a low voice, "Janelle, where is John holding you captive?" "I don't know." Janelle shook her head and choked up as she answered, "There are several basements in that place, and women like me are held captive in each basement. But every time I go out to sell drugs, John will have someone cover my eyes." Hearing this, Lassie frowned, and just as she looked at Roan, Janelle suddenly said, "But I know one thing." Chapter 159 Major Crime. Hearing Janelle's words, Lassie asked hurriedly, "What's the matter?" "The house where we are imprisoned should be not far from the sea." Janelle said that one night she was blindfolded by John's men and taken to a seaside villa to sell drugs. During the intermission, she opened the window of the villa and smelled an indescribable smell of the sea. And Janelle could smell this smell every day in the house where she was imprisoned. "Okay, Janelle, you are great." After writing down this important information in the small notebook, Lassie praised her in a low voice. Luo An thought for a few seconds and continued to ask, "Janelle, was the one who attacked you in the deep pit by the sea the John you mentioned?" "No, that man is Tony, and he is John's most trusted subordinate." Janelle shook her head, indicating that Tony would not listen to anyone else's orders except John. It was also Tony's job to blindfold them and take them to meet prostitutes every time. Not only that, this Tony has mental problems. He usually speaks incoherently. For women who don't obey his orders, he prefers to use physical persuasion rather than verbal commands. After listening to Janelle's narration, Lassie's face was full of disgust, and she wrote a line of words heavily in the small notebook, "Extremely controlling desire." Luo An's eyebrows twitched, and he tilted his head to think for a while. He briefly recounted the forensic discovery that several girls had undergone breast augmentation surgery, and then asked, "Janelle, do you know about that surgery?" "I know." Hearing about this surgery, Janelle nodded heavily, and a gleam of light shone in her eyes. "The breast augmentation surgery was performed in one of the rooms in the house where we were imprisoned. A sister who was also from Ukraine and had undergone that surgery once told me that the doctor was also Ukrainian, very old, and he touched her before the surgery. Lassie, who was standing aside, heard this and quickly wrote down the information. Luo An's eyes lit up. Very good, Janelle. The information you provided is very useful. As long as it's useful. Janelle smiled bitterly. I just hope you can catch John and the others quickly and rescue the sisters who are still imprisoned. Because once someone gets sick or breaks the rules, such as asking for help from a client, John will order Tony to kill her afterwards. Lassie looked up at Luo An, and Luo An's eyebrows twitched when he saw this. Obviously, both of them thought of the cause of death of Philomena's sister, using the client's mobile phone to ask for help. After chatting for a while, Ron and Lassie agreed with Janelle that the FBI New York headquarters would send an artist to draw a simulated portrait of John, Tony and others, based on her description. What a bunch of damn guys. Sitting in the passenger seat of the SUV, Lassie looked at the records in the small notebook and immediately showed disgust and anger. Human traffickers are really the most disgusting guys in the world. They should be shot to death. Roan, who was sitting in the driver's seat, glanced at Lassie, was silent for a while, took out his mobile phone and called Mona. The call was quickly connected, and Mona's questioning voice came from the other end of the phone. How is it, Luo An? Have you found any clues? Of course. Luo An briefly described the doctor's clues found by the forensic doctor, as well as the clues that Janelle just described, and finally asked in a deep voice, Mona, did you find the information of the prostitute who called Philomena? Like Lassie, Mona also cursed after listening to Janelle's narration, because she often used her computer skills to browse the databases of various departments. Mona knew her data, that is, about 1/5 of women in the Federation have been sexually assaulted. This part of people are only women who have information in the federal government. It does not include women like Janelle who were coerced and whose identity information is not yet in the database. If these women are counted, the 1/5 data will only be more, not less. But now is not the time to think about these things. Hearing Ron's question, Mona immediately answered in a serious tone. I have found the guy. His name is Judd Smith, a former FDNY, New York Fire Department member. His information shows that he is currently unemployed and staying at home. Good. After getting Judd's home address, Ron nodded with satisfaction, turned the key to start the SUV, and rushed out with a step on the accelerator. An apartment building in the eastern part of Queens. Listen, two agents, Judd, who was shirtless and had a long face, spread his hands and said expressionlessly, I don't know what you are talking about. Please leave my house, thank you. After that, Judd was about to close the door. Seeing this, Judd grabbed the edge of the door and smiled faintly. Judd, we have come to find you. Do you think you don't know? Feeling the force coming from the door, the former firefighter Judd's face changed. He did not rush to answer Luo An's question, but pushed the door again. Luo An saw this, his eyes seemed to be smiling, and he also silently increased his strength to push the door. The two people stared at each other's eyes and began to increase their strength. The strength in their hands became stronger and stronger. The muscles on Judd's arms began to bulge a little bit, and he looked a little hideous. Luo An still looked calm. He didn't drink the physical potion every day in vain. With the increase in the strength potion he drank before, it didn't matter if the other party was a former firefighter. He dared to compete with the weightlifting champion. He poured strength into his arms and Luo An increased his strength again. Judd's face changed immediately. He felt that Luo An's strength suddenly increased a lot. The door that he had pushed back a little with great difficulty was pushed back again. Judd increased his strength again. The veins in his arms bulged, his muscles were solid together, and the big tendons in his neck were tightly stretched. Hearing the sound like constipation coming from Judd's throat, Lassie, who had learned about Luo An's terrifying strength from Ryder, rolled her eyes and whispered, Luo An, investigating the case is more important. Okay. Judd also heard this, but before he could react, as Luo An agreed to Lassie's words, an unimaginable force suddenly came from the opposite side. Bang! With a loud bang, the front door of the house was smashed directly against the wall next to it, and Judd was also thrown onto the sofa in the living room by the sudden huge force. Fouquet. Lassie, who was standing by, was shocked. She had indeed heard from Ryder that Owen was very strong, but she didn't expect his strength to be this great. Lassie blinked. If she was not mistaken, the door seemed to have left a mark on the wall. Son of Jard, who was sitting on the sofa, had his pupils trembling, and his face was full of disbelief. When he was a firefighter, although he was not the strongest among his colleagues, he could be ranked in the top 3. But based on the situation just now, even the first-ranked colleague is definitely not as strong as the FBI agent in front of him. I know what you're thinking, Jard. You went there just to get it done in one go. Dating is so troublesome, right? Luo An walked into the room with a smile on his face, as if nothing had happened, and said calmly, I don't want to criticize you. I just want to know where the place was, okay? Sitting on the sofa, Jard looked up at Luo An's smiling face in front of him. He was silent for a while, and decisively chose to follow his heart. Okay. This is not a clickbait title, but the content was modified after review, but the chapter title cannot be changed. I'm really sorry, I will learn from my lesson next time. Chapter 160 Augustus, I'm a heartthrob. In the living room. I don't know which specific place you want me to mention. Jard sat on the sofa, silent for a while, picked up the water on the table, and drank it all, and explained, the process every time is that I say the time, the other party says the place, and finally I drive there with money to enjoy the service. But the other party says a different place every time, so. Lassie on the side curled her lips. Wow, enjoy the service, it's really a high-end term. Jard disagreed. I'm taking the lawyer's license exam. Of course I have to learn some academic terms. Luo An was too lazy to care about things other than this case. He took the small notebook from Lassie and threw it in front of Jard, saying in a calm voice, then write down every place you have been to before. Also, how you contacted the other party, phone number, time, etc. Or write it down clearly. Glancing at the cracks on the door and the wall, and the crisp sound when Luo An clenched his fist, Jard's mouth twitched and sighed, then lowered his head, and wrote a lot on the paper. Luo An nodded with satisfaction, while Lassie took a deep look at Luo An, her lips slightly raised. Jacob Federal Building, Office Area of Investigation Team 5. The information written by Jard indicates that the place he goes to every time is the townhouse at the intersection of Long Island Highway 84 and Highway 9. Luo An sat at his workstation and had a coffee break while Lassie showed the information in the small notebook to Mona and explained. According to Jard, he found the contact information on a website for recruiting people on the internet, and the URL is here. Glancing at the URL on the small notebook, Mona tapped on the keyboard with her 10 fingers, and soon, dozens of photos of women appeared in front of everyone. These are the advertisement photos of escort girls on this website. Mona's face was serious, her 10 fingers were flying, and a burst of unclear codes flashed on the computer, and another 8 photos appeared in front of Luo An and others. Ryder on the side asked in confusion, what does this mean? Mona explained, these are visa photos from Ukraine. After facial recognition, these 8 photos are exactly the same as the photos of the escort girls on the website. Luo An concluded expressionlessly, in other words, these 8 women from Ukraine are most likely to have been deceived by that John to come to New York, just like Janelle. Yeah. Mona nodded, and Lassie continued to ask, can you find out who is behind this website, and where he is now? I actually checked it just now. To register a website domain name in the United States, there is no need to file a record or report it to the government. At the same time, the domain name registrar will also hide the registrant's information to protect their privacy. Faced with this situation, there are only 2 ways to find out who is behind this website. The first is to go through formal channels, that is, to contact the domain name registrar of this ZOPO website and ask them to hand over relevant information. But this situation is time consuming and laborious, so Mona decisively chose the second way, which is to hack into the server of the domain name registrar and directly search for relevant information about this ZOPO website. Unfortunately, Mona tapped the keyboard a few times, showing the information in the computer to everyone, and sighed and said, the registrant of this website domain name is a dead person who died 3 years ago. Lassie and Ryder's faces collapsed when they heard this. It's okay. Seeing the low morale of several people, Roan grinned, patted Mona on the shoulder and said, "Isn't this website still open? The phone number on it can be dialed." Hearing this, Mona and Lass's eyes lit up, looking at Roan, and said in unison, "You mean phishing enforcement?" "Yeah." Roan nodded. Janelle and Jard had said before that the other party blindfolded the girls and Tony took them to the door for service. We can arrest Tony at that time. Then by interrogating Tony, we can find the place where John and they imprisoned the girls. Ryder also reacted, grinned, and clapped his hands, praising it loudly as a great idea. This method does not violate FBI regulations, especially since investigator number 5 still has Janelle as a witness. But there is a problem before them. Who will play the role of the client? Mona is definitely not suitable. Neither is Lassie. Although she has rich experience in nightclubs, she is a woman after all. Roan has experience, can act, and is a man, so he seems to be suitable for playing the role of the client. But he has appeared on TV before, and no one can guarantee whether John and Tony have read the New York Daily News that day. Just in case, Roan is not suitable either. In the end, only Ryder is left. But Ryder also has a problem, that is, he is not good at acting and disguising, but he is very good at fighting. And the other party must bargain with Ryder about money before Ryder starts to move with the woman. If the other party finds something wrong during the process, then this mission will definitely fail. So, the four of them looked at each other and fell silent for a while. Additional meal. Additional meal. Just as Luo An was scratching his head, thinking about whether to use the Macube technique taught by the old killer in his previous life, Augustus suddenly pushed open the door and walked in with a large box of hamburgers. Throwing the hamburgers to the technicians of the number 5 investigation team one by one, Augustus finally walked to Luo An and the other 3, handed them the hamburgers, and asked with a grin, "What's wrong? Did you encounter any difficulties?" The 4 took the hamburgers, looked at Augustus carefully, and were silent for a while, and finally looked at the other 3 people. They all saw the light in each other's eyes. Seeing that the 4 people didn't speak, Augustus frowned, and just as he was about to ask again what happened, Luo An suddenly walked in front of him, with a sunny smile on his face, and whispered, "Sir, do you want to know about group sex?" Augustus. At 9 o'clock in the evening, outside a small villa at the intersection of Long Island Highway 13 and Highway 9, Augustus was sitting in a boot car. Fully armed Roan and Riyadh were sitting in a Chevrolet not far away, while fully armed Mona and Lassie were sitting in a sedan in the other direction. "Hello. Hello. Can you hear me?" In the book, August was holding a small communicator to check whether the equipment was working properly. "I can hear you, sir." Roan and the Chevrolet grinned. "We heard every word you said clearly." Augustus, who understood Roan's subtext, immediately laughed and scolded. "Very good, Roan. It seems that you and Riyadh can learn a lot of useful new knowledge from me today." Roan laughed. "Don't forget Lassie, sir. Be careful that she will find Verenith to accuse you of discriminating against lesbians later. Don't take me with you." Lassie in another car rolled her eyes when she heard this. "August's technology is not suitable for me." That's not necessarily true. In the book, Augustus carefully sorted out his equipment and clothes, and smiled lightly. "Let me tell you a secret. When I was young, I was more handsome than Roan. At that time, the ladies around me called me Mr. Charming." Mona, Riyadh, Lassie. The 3 of them were speechless, and Roan nodded with admiration. Sure enough, there was a reason why Augustus could become a leader. Even bullets can't penetrate this face. At this moment, a 7-seater station wagon suddenly drove over from a distance. Seeing this, Luo An and others immediately threw their jokes aside, and their faces became serious. Chapter 161 I want them all. The station wagon slowly stopped at the roadside, but no one got out. Luo An narrowed his eyes when he saw this, and Riyadh wondered if he had guessed the wrong target. At this moment, Augustus' phone suddenly rang on the communicator. There was a deep voice on the other end of the phone. After the other party remotely controlled Augustus to enter the small villa with the door unlocked, the door of the station wagon was slowly pushed open. 6 women with delicate faces, curvy figures, and wearing hip skirts got out of the car. Wow. Seeing this, Riyad silently clenched the gun in his hand and said calmly, "If I had known this mission would happen, I would have gone on it myself." I recorded this sentence. Roan, who was in the driver's seat of the Chevrolet, raised his eyebrows when he heard this. While carefully checking the weapon, he said with a smile, "I'll send it to Ivana later." Hearing this, Riyad's movements and expression suddenly froze. After a few seconds of silence, he asked in confusion, "Aren't we going up now?" "Wait a moment." Roan shook his head, pointed at the station wagon and said, "The other party's car is not turned off. If we act now, the other party has a chance to escape successfully. Wait until Augustus leaves all 6 girls behind, and the other party turns off the car, then we will act." Riyad, Lassie and Mona heard this, and nodded loudly in unison, "No problem." On the other side, the door of the villa was slowly opened by Augustus. Seeing these girls who were about the same age as his daughter, Augustus felt very solemn, but still showed a pleasant expression on his face. "Good evening, girls. Come in." "Good evening, Mr. Thomas." Thomas was Augustus's alias. No one used their real name when they were out having fun. Seeing that the person in front of them was a black man with a big belly, all 6 women frowned. But the leading woman still walked into the villa with a smile, and asked with a smile, "How is it, Mr. Thomas? Are you satisfied with us?" "Of course I'm satisfied." Augustus poured a glass of water, and drank it in one gulp, then rubbed his hands, and showed an impatient look on his face. "What's the price?" The leading girl did not answer immediately, but smiled and asked back, "Tell me first, how many do you want to choose, Mr. Thomas? 1, 2, or 3? Augustus waved his hand. "I want them all." Hearing this, the 6 girls' eyebrows twitched immediately, and the leading girl stopped talking nonsense and said directly, "Then you need to pay first. 6 people 1 hour 1800, 2 hours 3500. Give me the money, I will tell the driver, we have discussed it, and then." At this point, the girl licked her lips. "Okay, no problem." Acting the whole set, Augustus decisively took out a stack of US dollars from his pocket, counted them, and handed them to the other party. Seeing the girl from the capital take out her cell phone and start sending messages, Augustus turned and walked to the bathroom next to him, smiling. "I'm going to take a shower. Girls, wait for me for a few minutes." Outside the small villa, the man in the station wagon picked up his cell phone and looked at it, then turned off the car. Seeing this, Roan said to the communicator without any nonsense, "Action." After receiving the order, fully armed, Riyad, Lassie and Mona, who had been waiting for a long time, immediately opened the car door and got out of the car. The 4 people, holding Glock pistols, bent over on both sides of the station wagon and slowly approached in a vigilant posture. At this moment, the man in the car suddenly discovered something. His face changed, and he quickly turned the key to start the car. Bang, 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 bang. Seeing this, Roan and Riyad did not waste any words and immediately pulled the trigger to hit the front and rear tires of the car. Puff, with the sound of gas leakage, Lassie and Mona on the other side also ran to the side of the car. Bang, bang, crash. The 2 women opened fire, smashing the front and rear windows of the tourist car, then aimed their Glocks at the man in the driver's seat and shouted together, "FBI, don't move. Put your hands on the steering wheel. Otherwise we will shoot." Upon hearing this, the man turned his head with a ferocious face and looked at Lassie and Mona. The 2 women also saw the man's face clearly. He looked exactly like Tony in Janelle's simulated portrait. Mona and Lassie's words did not make Tony choose to surrender. On the contrary, Tony's face was ferocious. He opened his mouth and shouted like a beast, then stood up and pounced on Mona outside the passenger window. Bang, crash. But before Tony's body completely left the driver's seat, Roan, who had already walked to the side of the car, smashed the glass on the driver's door with a punch, and then grabbed Tony's collar tightly. "What are you yelling about?" Tony's body was forced to stagnate when he rushed forward, and before he could react, Ryder opened the car door, and Roan took advantage of the situation to change his hand, and pulled Tony out of the driver's seat. Seeing Tony turn around and bite him, Roan frowned, and immediately used the force and direction of pulling him out, to throw him behind him with both hands. Under Roan's terrifying force, Tony was like a rag doll, drawing a beautiful arc in the air, and then fell heavily on the hard road. Bang, accompanied by the sound of a heavy object hitting the ground. Ryder didn't know if it was an illusion, but he seemed to hear the sound of a broken bone. Tony's eyes were red, and he yelled and climbed up on the spot. He didn't choose to run away, but swung his fist and rushed towards Roan again. Seeing Tony's action, Mona, Lassie and Ryder didn't waste any words and immediately aimed at Tony's arms and thighs and pulled the trigger. Bang, bang, bang. At such a close range, the three people's bullets all hit the target very accurately. But what shocked the three people was that, although Tony showed pain when he was shot, he still gritted his teeth and swung his fist towards Luo An. "It's okay." Luo An raised his eyebrows and signaled the three people not to continue shooting. It was more important to keep him alive. Then he stretched forward and swung his right fist. The fist with all the strength of his body was as powerful as lightning and hit Tony's chest hard. Bang! Tony was hit in the chest by a heavy punch without reacting at all, and his chest suddenly sank. The terrifying huge force erupted in an instant, and Tony flew backwards. His body rushed all the way, and finally fell hard back to the place where he had just fallen. Unlike the last time, this time Tony no longer had the strength to get up. Although his eyes were still red, the sunken chest was very obvious, and the severe pain from it was far beyond his endurance. Tony made a few ho-ho sounds in his throat, and spit out a mouthful of blood. Finally, his head tilted, and he fainted completely. The atmosphere at the scene was solemn and quiet. Mona and Lassie were stunned. They looked at Tony, who had fainted on the ground in front of them, and the sunken chest, and the scene of the moment just now kept stirring in their minds. Next to him, a very shocking scene completely shocked Reed. Standing next to Roan, his eyes were wide open, his mind was blank, and he even forgot to breathe. Although Reed had long known that Roan was very strong and powerful, he only had a rough guess as to how strong and to what extent. But Roan's performance just now clearly told Reed that his guess still underestimated Roan. This strength is enough to go to the professional arena to fight boxing. "Call an ambulance." Roan took a deep breath and retracted his fist. He told Mona and the others to call an ambulance, saying that Tony still had clues and couldn't die, and walked quickly towards the villa. "Wait a minute, Roan." Mona heard Roan's order and immediately took out her phone without hesitation. Lassie and Ryder, who had reacted, saw Roan's action and quickly suppressed their shock and asked loudly, "What are you doing in the villa?" Chapter 160. To the 69-year-old master. Looking at Luo An's back, Lassie asked loudly, "What are you doing in the villa?" Luo An did not look back and answered as he walked, "I'm going to see Augustus and remind him not to make mistakes." Lassie, Reed. Seeing the speechless expressions on the two's faces, Luo An smiled and said it was just a joke. His real target was actually the 6 girls, especially the girl in the lead with the mobile phone. Maybe he could learn the location of the house where they were imprisoned from that girl. In the villa, Augustus sat upright, looking at the 6 girls sitting on the big bed opposite him with a serious face. The moment the gunshots rang out outside, the 6 girls suddenly turned pale and subconsciously wanted to escape from the villa. Augustus spent a lot of effort to calm them down. But unfortunately, because he needed to act, Augustus did not carry any FBI-related documents. So no matter how Augustus asked them now, the girls clenched their fingers, lowered their heads quietly, and said nothing. Just as Augustus was helpless with his hands on his hips, the battle outside had ended, and Luo An knocked on the door and walked in. After entering the villa, Luo An first reported the results of the operation. "Sir, the mission was successful, and Tony was successfully arrested by us." "Very good." Augustus nodded with satisfaction, but there was no expression of surprise or shock on his face. It was just a small operation to ambush and arrest criminals in advance. Given Luo An's previous performance, Augustus would be shocked if the operation failed. After briefly describing the situation of the girls in the room, Augustus patted Luo An on the shoulder and said that the next step would be handed over to him. "No problem." Luo An nodded decisively and agreed. He looked at the girl in the lead and asked, "Where is the place where Tony imprisoned you?" Luo An's clothes, equipment, and words were not for display. This time, the 6 girls did not remain silent, and all answered Luo An's questions. 2 girls even looked at Luo An quietly while answering questions. Luo An's behavior of punching Tony away just now was seen clearly by the two girls leaning against the window, and coupled with Luo An's handsome face in front of them, the two girls' eyes lit up. The girl in the lead said, "Tony blindfolded us before taking us into the car. We didn't know where that place was." Roan's expression remained unchanged. He had already guessed this from Janelle, and continued to ask, "How long did Tony drive after you got in the car?" The girls looked at each other, discussed in a low voice for a moment, and finally answered, "About 45 minutes. Okay." Considering the possibility that Tony drove around in circles, Roan was ready to turn back and ask Mona to carefully check the surveillance of this area, and then continued to ask these girls questions. Hearing Roan mention the doctor who performed the breast augmentation surgery, the girl who saw him punch Tony away just now raised her hand and shouted, "I know his name." "What's his name?" "Edward Mahajlo." The girl said the doctor's name, and said that this was the driver's license information in the doctor's pocket when she was serving the doctor before the doctor performed the breast augmentation surgery on her. "Your information has been very helpful to us. Thank you very much." Luo An took out a notepad and asked the girl to write down the letters of her name. Then he walked out of the villa quickly and handed the paper to Mona. "Check this guy," Luo An said with a smile. "If we are lucky, we can not only solve Tony's big meal tonight, but also have dessert later." "No problem." Taking the note from Luo An, Mona did not hesitate and immediately ran to the car not far away. Just like young people in a few years will be inseparable from mobile phones, Mona now can't live without a laptop. With 10 fingers tapping on the keyboard, Mona quickly found relevant information about Edward Mahalo. This guy immigrated to the Federation from Ukraine 10 years ago and is 69 years old this year. 2 years ago, his private clinic was closed by the government due to financial problems, and he has been unemployed until now. A 69-year-old comrade is still so energetic. Luo An's mind flashed with the figure of martial arts master, and he shook his head hurriedly and asked, "Where does this guy live?" "In the East District of Queens." After getting the specific address, Luo An and Mona were preparing to guard Tony and go to the hospital, while Ryder and Lassie immediately drove to the target location. At 11:30 that night, in a dark alley on a street in Queens, Ryder and Lassie successfully captured Edward Mahalo, who was discussing the meaning of life with a street machine girl. The next morning, investigation team number 5. Seeing Roan and Riyad walk out of the interrogation room, Lassie and Mona hurried over and asked, "How is it? Did Edward tell us where John and the others are hiding?" Last night, Mona carefully checked the surveillance cameras around the villa, but the area was being developed at the moment, and many surveillance cameras were forced to stop working, so Mona found nothing in the end. Throwing the notebook on the table, Roan took a sip of coffee and sighed. Edward wanted to tell, but he didn't know at all. John protected the location of the house very strictly. Every time he asked Edward to perform surgery on the girls, just like taking the girls out for service, he would blindfold him in advance. For the breast augmentation surgery, John was responsible for providing materials and tools, and Edward was only responsible for the operation. And the reward John paid Edward was not specific money, but the service the girls provided to him at the beginning or end of the operation. After listening to Roan's interrogation record, Lassie spat and cursed in a low voice, "Old scum." Mona next to her looked at another interrogation room and asked, "What should we do next? Continue to interrogate Tony?" "Yeah." Roan drank all the coffee in the cup in one gulp. The bitter feeling rushed to his forehead, making his brain clear instantly. Then he looked at Mona and Lassie who were packing up, and said, "Lassie, you and I will interrogate Tony later. Mona, I have a more important job that needs you." Mona looked up in confusion when she heard this. Luo An explained, "Last night, the girls said that Tony drove for about half an hour to reach the villa. The place is jarred, told us about are not far from there, plus the deep pit on the seashore where Janelle escaped." Hearing this, Mona's beautiful eyes widened and suddenly realized, by combining the 3 areas with time, we can find the approximate hiding area of John and his men. Throwing a look at Luo An that said, "You are so smart, why didn't I think of it?" Mona immediately sat down at her workstation and started typing on the keyboard. After taking a deep look at Mona, Lassie silently sighed at her rapid progress and then followed Luo into the interrogation room. At the door of the interrogation room, Lassie was about to push the door open, but Luo An suddenly reached out and grabbed her. Huh? Lassie asked with a puzzled look on her face. What's wrong? After a long pause, Luo An pulled Lassie to the other side of the interrogation room door, a little far away, and whispered, Lassie, you came from the intelligence department, right? If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 163 Interrogation and Acting. Hearing Roan's question, Lassie was a little confused, but still nodded. Yeah, don't you know this? I just want to confirm it. Roan handed the folder in his hand to Lassie and explained, remember the personality characteristics of Tony in Janel's description before? Of course. Hearing this, Lassie said with a serious face, Tony never uses words to persuade women who resist him, but beats them directly. This shows that Tony has a strong desire for control and advocates violence. On the other hand, it also shows that Tony looks down on women and subconsciously believes that women are weak and vulnerable. Lassie has been in the intelligence department for a long time. Through the actions and behaviors of the target person, she analyzes the character and thoughts of the person and has some information and knowledge. It's just not deep, but these are enough for Lassie to mix like a fish in water in the nightclub. Because of this, Lassie also saw the complicated situation between Mona and Roan during this period, which neither of the two parties noticed. After hearing Lassie's narration, Roan added, and the multiple wounds on the 22 bodies also show that Tony likes to be sadistic. If this kind of person faces a woman who is in a higher status than him and has the initiative between the two, but is a little afraid of him, then he will only. Before Roan finished speaking, Lassie's face was full of realization, and then she gritted her teeth and took over the rest of the words. He will only be more excited. Roan nodded and then said, but this situation is also very beneficial to us. This means that Tony will let down his guard when facing the weak. That's right. Closing the folder in her hand, Lassie took a deep breath, looked up at Luo An, and said in a deep voice, let's do this. Luo An, I will conduct this interrogation alone. Luo An stared at Lassie's eyes. Are you sure? Lassie looked solemn and nodded heavily. I'm sure. Okay. Seeing the determination in Lassie's eyes, Luo An hesitated for a few seconds and nodded in agreement, but did not forget to add, remember to turn on the surveillance video after entering the room. I will always pay attention in the monitoring room next door. No problem. In the corridor, Luo An simply wrote some interrogation words, language, and action performance in the folder and handed them to Lassie. Then Luo An turned around and pushed open the door of another room and walked into the monitoring room, which was the first time he entered since joining the number 5 investigation team. If it weren't for this case, Luo An would have forgotten that the number 5 investigation team had such a room. After carefully reading the words written by Luo An for a while, Lassie took a deep breath, put away the serious expression on her face, and slowly opened the door of the interrogation room. Luo An had already provided her with the lines, and now it was up to her acting skills. In the interrogation room, Tony, looking pale, sat in a wheelchair, with a bandage wrapped around his chest and his hands handcuffed to the interrogation table. When Lassie entered the room, she did not look at Tony, but turned on the surveillance camera in the room as agreed before. Not only that, after sitting in the chair opposite Tony, Lassie did not ask questions immediately, but while checking the folder, she glanced at Tony with her peripheral vision, and at the same time, she showed a somewhat uncomfortable expression on her face. Tony, who had a sullen face, saw this scene, and a playful light suddenly appeared in his eyes. Ahem, so. After a long silence, Lassie coughed twice. Her voice trembled at first, but gradually became firm. I will be responsible for interrogating you today, Tony. Tony stared at Lassie and asked in a low voice, can I ask your name? Lassie subconsciously shook her head, but quickly reacted and asked sternly, I'm interrogating you, Tony. Tell me, what's the matter with this case? Seeing Lassie's actions, Tony's eyes became more teasing. "Sorry, I have nothing to say to you." Lassie frowned, looked down at the words, written by Luo An, then stared at Tony, and said in a deep voice, "Why not say it? Isn't that your hobby? You like to torture women, like to see them in pain. This feeling makes you unable to stop, right?" Tony did not answer, but just raised the corners of his mouth slightly, looking at Lassie quietly. "You tortured those women. You were fascinated by the feeling of doing whatever you wanted and controlling everything. Especially the look in their eyes and movements before they died, which made you feel as if you were the god who dominated them." According to the process written by Luo An in the document, Lassie continued, "But you messed up one thing. You forgot that you are not a real god. When you killed Janelle, you didn't stab her directly with a knife as usual. Instead, you violated her in the car. We found relevant surveillance footage, and then you took her to the beach." Hearing this, Tony's slightly raised mouth corners suddenly disappeared. He knocked on the interrogation table with angrily and shouted, "You're lying. I have never violated a woman in a car." After shouting, Tony saw that the fear in Lassie's eyes disappeared and was replaced by the same mockery in his eyes, and then he suddenly reacted. Bang! Without waiting for Tony to speak, Roan pushed open the door of the interrogation room and walked in, patted Lassie on the shoulder, and said with a smile, "Well done, Lassie." Lassie shook her head, saying that it was all Roan's excellent lines. The surveillance video of the scene just now has been recorded. When Lassie described it earlier, Tony had a look of enjoyment on his face and did not refute, but when Lassie lied, Tony could not sit still. For the jury in the court, this had exactly the same effect as Tony's confession. "You again." Seeing Roan's handsome face, Tony's eyes instantly turned red, and he subconsciously wanted to get up and pounce on him. Bang! But unfortunately, Tony's hands were handcuffed tightly, and the wound on the murderer's hand had not healed yet, so he was forced to sit back. Just after he stood up, sitting down next to Lassie, Roan said without any nonsense, "Tell me, Tony, where is the villa?" Tony's face was grim. "You think?" At the subsequent summons, the court will read out my colleague's written statement. "You know, the media loves serial killers the most." Roan crossed his arms, interrupted Tony, and said expressionlessly, "When John later learned from the news that it was because of your mistake that his illegal industry was discovered, he was targeted by the FBI, wanted by the FBI, and eventually lost everything. If John had been alive outside the prison, what do you think he would do?" Tony did not answer. Roan told him the final ending. "He will definitely find someone to kill you in prison. You're dead." Hearing Roan's words, Tony's face turned black and purple. Although Tony is a pervert, he only likes to persecute and torture others. He is happy to kill others, but being killed by others. After a long silence, Tony raised his head and looked at Luo An with gritted teeth. "Damn FBI. I demand that you provide me with protection. The highest level." Luo An's face was calm. "First, tell me where John and those girls are now." Chapter 164 Shotgun and Stun Grenade. In a villa area near the sea in Bayshore, Long Island, a mobile vehicle slowly stopped on the road outside the villa area, and two fully armed SWAT teams got out of the vehicle. Riyadh was feeling the sea breeze and looking at the beach and sea glittering in the sun in the distance, as well as the lush green vegetation in the villa area. While sorting out his equipment, he said, "I didn't expect that a guy like John would hide in such a beautiful place." Luo An carefully checked his bulletproof vest and Glock 18. Hearing Riyadh sigh, he smiled. "You know, just like in the movies, beautiful places always hide unknown crimes." Before Riyadh could answer, the two of them suddenly heard the voice of a SWAT team member. "We have arrived at the designated location and found 4 adult males with guns on the first floor of the target villa. There are obstacles on the second floor and the situation is unclear." "Okay." After exchanging a glance with Riyadh, the two of them put away the expressions on their faces. Luo An said in a serious voice, "Team 1, immediately enter the periphery of the villa and move to the designated position in the plan. If the situation is right, rush into the villa to perform the mission immediately." Received. After receiving the order, Team 1 immediately broke into the lawn outside the villa in a alert posture without making any noise. Before they arrived at the designated location, the SWAT team member in front, who was responsible for monitoring the scene, suddenly shouted loudly, "Enemy appeared on the second floor of the villa. We have been discovered. Everyone go." Hearing this, Luo An immediately ordered the SWAT team members to launch a strong attack, and he and Ryder rushed into the villa with guns in hand. Bang! The SWAT team members held a door-breaking hammer and smashed the door on the first floor of the villa with force, and the team members behind followed closely and rushed in. FBI, don't move. The SWAT team members holding rifles shouted slogans while holding rifles to quickly check every room in the villa. Bang, bang, bang. Seeing that someone on the first floor of the villa dared to resist with a gun, the SWAT team members did not waste words and pulled the trigger directly to shoot in the head. In a few seconds, the first floor of the villa was cleared, and Luo An and Ryder also walked into the villa at this time. Safe. Go, go, go. The SWAT team members rushed to the second floor quickly, and Ryder stood on the first floor with some doubts. Tony said that the girls were imprisoned in the basement. Where is the basement? After carefully observing the first floor of the villa, Luo An quickly cast his eyes on the large wardrobe under the stairs of the villa. At this time, the door of the wardrobe had been opened by the SWAT team. When they checked the safety, Luo An slowly approached with a Glock in his hand, stretched out his hand to push away the clothes inside, and a door with a deflected direction appeared in front of him. Seeing this, Reed grinned, gave Luo An a thumbs up, and then raised his foot to kick the door open. But he was stopped by Luo An. Reed was a little confused, and then he saw Luo An took out 2 stun grenades from his pocket. Reed was speechless. Since Luo An came to the 5th investigation team, the equipment funding expenditure for each mission, stun grenades, together with bullets, has become the largest expenditure. Luo An didn't know what Reed was thinking in his heart, and even if he knew, he wouldn't care. Bullets have no eyes, and life is important. Using stun grenades to disintegrate the enemy's resistance in advance is undoubtedly the best solution. As for the funding expenditure for stun grenades, Augustus is the leader of the 5th investigation team. What does it have to do with him? Luo An. Augustus. After exchanging a glance with Reed, Roan counted down to 3, and then threw 2 stun grenades directly behind the door. As soon as it was opened, bang, bang, Fouquet. The 2 stun grenades exploded successfully, and a man's curse sounded. Reed immediately rushed into the basement, where a man was lying on the ground with his eyes covered and wailing. He kicked the man unconscious to relieve his pain. Roan bent down to pick up the shotgun next to the man, and simply clicked it to show it to Reed, smiling. It's loaded and ready to shoot. If Reed had really rushed into the basement with a gun just now, the shotgun would definitely be able to break the bulletproof vest on Reed's chest at such a close distance. The title of the King of Close Combat is not in vain. After expressing his gratitude to Roan in a low voice, Reed looked at his pistol and fell silent. He now has some doubts about his combat experience in SWAT in the first half of his life. After tearing the shotgun into pieces, Roan carefully looked at the basement in front of him. The basement was only half the size of the first floor of the villa, but it was divided into 3 rooms. There was a toilet in one of the small rooms, and the other 2 slightly larger rooms were filled with half-dressed women. Just as Reed bent over the man to search for the key to open the room, a SWAT team member walked in and said, "Sir, John has been caught under the bed on the 2nd floor." "Well done." Roan patted Reed's shoulder, handed the place over to him, and walked out of the basement to the upstairs. More than an hour later, the mission was a complete success. Under Roan's leadership, the SWAT team successfully killed 6 gangsters and captured the gang leader John, whose real name was Worsham Turner, and rescued 41 imprisoned girls. With all the evidence, John and Tony directly opened a room in the prison. However, there is a chain of discrimination between prisoners in American prisons. Tony and John, the 2 guys who trafficked and tortured women, had a very bad experience in prison. They were responsible for the dirty work in prison, and being slapped in the face, and having someone spit in their food, were all minor matters. The real big thing happened in the shower. Investigation Team Number 5. On the TV at the front of the office area, government workers in the Long Island area were talking to a large group of reporters. The spokesperson only mentioned the cracking of the Seaside Deep Pit serial murder case in one sentence, and more topics were still related to local development and investment promotion. As for the group of reporters, after the spokesperson finished his long speech, they decisively threw the topic of investment promotion aside and began to ask about the specific content of the case. The media is always like this. When they encounter a serial killer, they get so excited that they can't sleep. It was almost time to get off work, and Lassie was packing up in advance while complaining, but they always selectively ignore cases of human trafficking related to sex. Riyad calmly took a sip of coffee and said, "There's nothing we can do. After all, they are the media. They have to make money by attracting people's attention." Not only that, Mona finished typing on the keyboard, closed the laptop, turned around and smiled and continued, "If you only look at the data comparison, as an ordinary person, the possibility of being murdered by the person next to you is 17 times the possibility of being targeted by a serial killer. Of course, the media prefers to report low probability events." Lassie nodded thoughtfully, and Riyad, who was married, asked seriously, "Mona, is your data accurate? Isn't this very normal data?" Mona threw a pair of sanitary bowls to Riyad. "Which couple has never thought of killing each other directly when they have a conflict?" Ignoring Riyad, who had fallen silent, Mona turned to look at Luo An, who had been silent, and asked puzzledly, "Roan, what are you thinking about?" Chapter 165. Married for 20 years. Daughter is 22 years old. Luo An turned his eyes away from the computer and replied with a smile, "I'm thinking about what to do in the next 2 days. After the Brentu's case was solved, the reward has not been paid yet because of the intervention of the Financial Crime Investigation Department. As for the Seaside Deep Pit serial murder case, because it was just solved today, but the next 2 days are weekends, the reward will definitely not be issued until next week. This week has passed, and the FBI is not working on Saturdays and Sundays." Hearing Luo An's words, the three people who just reacted immediately showed joy on their faces, and Mona and Lassie immediately gathered together and whispered. Considering that Mona never goes shopping with others, even if the other party is a woman, Luo An guessed that the content she and Lassie discussed was probably related to cosmetics. Because Lassie magically took out a lot of cosmetics, Luo An was very jealous of this skill of hiding things. But he didn't have a different dimensional space bag on his chest, so he couldn't learn it, even if he wanted to. "Will you come to my house tomorrow?" Ryder, who was standing next to him, pushed his coffee cup aside, patted his chest, and sent an invitation to Roan for a barbecue party. Every 2 weeks, Ryder and Ivana would invite relatives and friends to a grand barbecue party on the weekend. Roan's face was full of black lines when he recalled the last time he got drunk and felt dizzy the next day, and Ivana asked him to drink more wine to clear his head. The way Texas children treat people is too simple, and Roan is still a little uncomfortable. But having wine and meat is better than lying dead at home. Roan thought for a moment and was ready to agree. Augustus suddenly pushed open the door of the team leader's office and walked out, saying in his signature loud voice, "Everyone, I plan to give my wife a surprise tomorrow and hold a wedding anniversary party. Everyone must come if you are free." "What? Wedding anniversary?" Hearing this news, all the agents of the number 5 investigation team exclaimed in unison. Augustus patted his big belly and said with a smile that tomorrow was the 20th anniversary of his marriage, and his daughter was 22 years old, so he could hold a party to celebrate. Lassie, Riyad and others all smiled and said that they would definitely attend on time, and Luo An nodded and agreed. But 20 years of marriage, and the daughter is 22 years old. Standing aside, scratching his head, this math problem is a bit difficult, and Luo An is not very good at it. The next day, in the evening, Luo An arrived at Augustus's house on time. Augustus' daughter is named Leela. Before coming here, to be honest, Luo An had some other ideas about her life experience in his heart. But after seeing Leela's face, well, Leela has a good personality, and it can be seen that she is Augustus's biological daughter. Premarital pregnancy does not seem to be a big problem for black people. At least the father is not running away. After a few simple greetings, Luo An found it a little awkward. Everyone else brought their families, including Lassie. She brought a new girlfriend who was kidnapped from somewhere. Others who were invited also brought their wives, children, girlfriends, and boyfriends. It seemed that it was because it felt weird to attend a wedding anniversary party without someone. Just as Roan picked up a glass of wine and was about to go to Mona to chat, Augustus' wife, Celine, came over. Celine was very enthusiastic about Roan. She and Augustus walked to his side and took the initiative to chat with Roan. No, it should be said that Celine took the initiative to chat with Roan. She first praised Roan for his handsomeness, and then kept asking Roan in simple and indirect words, asking if Roan had a girlfriend, and how his private life was, and that her daughter Lyra didn't have a boyfriend yet, and how Roan felt about his daughter Lyra. Roan felt a little embarrassed. Augustus was also embarrassed. Lassie covered her mouth and laughed, and Mona was speechless. On the one hand, Augustus felt that his wife was a little rude, and on the other hand, Augustus had a clear understanding of his daughter's appearance. Ahem. Augustus used a series of small movements to remind his wife, but it seemed to have no effect. Fortunately, the arrival of the new guests diverted everyone's attention. Team leader Dylan from the Organized Crime Investigation Department, Agent Norton, and an unfamiliar young man. Seeing Dylan walk into the room, Augustus hurriedly strode up to him, hugged him, and patted his back hard. "Good evening, old man." Seeing this, Dylan was not to be outdone, and also laughed, and patted Augustus back hard. "Happy anniversary, Augustus." Bang, bang, bang. The huge muffled sound from the two patting each other's backs made everyone present frown. Luo An took the opportunity to leave Dylan, and walked to Agent Norton to chat. "Good evening, Norton." "Good evening, Luo An." Taking the wine handed to him by the other party, Norton looked at Luo An's handsome face, and while chatting with him, he was very moved. Last time, when Agent Norton met Roan, because of an undercover serial murder case, he found that Roan was an extraordinary talent, and he also had the idea of taking Roan to their Organized Crime Investigation Department. But after he expressed his thoughts, Team leader Dylan finally chose to refuse because of Augustus. Agent Norton felt very sorry about this. The leader said that he naturally couldn't take Roan privately afterwards. But Norton still chose to build a good relationship with Roan, such as going fishing together. Although Roan said that day that he forgot to wear a helmet, so he just kept watching him fishing. After the fishing incident, because a gangster at hand started to make trouble, Norton didn't contact Roan much in recent days. When he finally finished his work and came to his senses and was about to invite Roan out for a drink, he heard that Roan was promoted from an ordinary agent to a senior agent. Hearing this news, Norton's first reaction in his mind was impossible. Let's not talk about the fact that it has only been a short time since Luo An was promoted from an intern agent to a full-time agent. It took Norton several years to be promoted from a full-time agent to a senior agent. Why did you, Luo An, become my level so quickly? Through various means, Norton found out that Luo An had solved the bank serial robbery case, federal prosecutor's office explosion case, press conference explosion case, Park River mail corpse case, and yesterday Luo An solved the Seaside Deep Pit serial murder case. Although he didn't know the specific content and details of the case, seeing the number of cases, Agent Norton still fell silent. Then he wanted to run into the team leader's office and beat Dylan up. They have the Organized Crime Investigation Department, and they face those vicious, insidious, and cunning gangster criminals every day. Agents like Luo An who have brains and skills are exactly what they need. Why did you refuse before? Why didn't you snatch Luo An from Augustus? But even if he thought about it, Norton still didn't dare to really tear Dylan apart, and could only sigh silently with a sad face. Team leader Dylan actually regretted it very much, and he wanted to travel back to a previous time point to slap himself. He knew more about the situation than Norton, such as Mrs. Hello Eyes from the CIA who didn't win the resurrection match. But Roan was promoted to a senior agent, and Augustus watched Roan closely like a baby, so Dylan couldn't abduct Roan now. In short, one word, regret. Roan didn't know what Norton and Dylan thought, and he wouldn't care even if he knew. Isn't it good to work under a beautiful commander like Verinus? Why change places? After a few simple greetings with Norton, Roan turned his gaze to the young man next to Norton, whom he didn't know. Since entering Augustus's house, this young man has been staring at him. Roan clinked his glasses with Norton and asked, "Can you introduce the agent next to you?" Chapter 166 Jealousy in Trance. Hearing Roan's question, Norton said that the agent next to him was named Brenton. He was a billiard player in college and is now a new agent in their investigation team. Because of his good ability, he was highly valued by team leader Dylan, so he was also brought to this party today. Hello, Brenton. Roan stretched out his hand and shook the other party and asked with a smile, am I wearing the wrong clothes? Why are you staring at me? Sorry. Brenton bowed his head and apologized, picked up a glass of wine, and said that he was just a little curious about Roan. Brenton didn't say what he was curious about, but the other party immediately looked away and left. Roan's eyes flashed a gleam, and he continued to chat with Norton. The party officially began, and the guests wandered around. Augustus's home was not luxurious, but the two-story building had all kinds of facilities, and even a gym. But judging from Augustus's big belly, the user of this gym most of the time should be his daughter Lila. Although Lila's face was a bit reckless, her figure was even more reckless. She looked like someone who exercises regularly. There were many guests today, and the living room felt a bit crowded. Many people went to the gym. At Ryder's invitation, Roan and Norton also went there. They were going to exercise and try out the equipment there. Unexpectedly, Brenton also came. He walked directly to the billiard table in the corner of the gym, stroked the table with his hand, and then looked at Roan with a smile. This table is well maintained. Do you want to play with it? American billiards? Yes. Brenton was not bad looking to begin with, and he picked up a cue and made a cool move, which immediately attracted the attention of many female guests. Roan's expression did not change, but when he thought of Brenton's apology just now, he understood in his heart. It was obvious that Brenton wanted to use him as a stepping stone to show off. As for the reason for doing this, Roan glanced at Norton beside him, who was staring at Brenton. If he guessed correctly, Norton or Dylan should have mentioned him in front of Brenton. Luo An's guess was right. Brenton was indeed a little jealous of Luo An. Since he joined the organized crime investigation division, Norton or Dylan would criticize him every time he made a mistake at work. If it was just a simple criticism, Brenton would not have any other thoughts. He knew that he had to admit his mistakes. But every time after being criticized, Norton or Dylan would mention the name Luo An and sigh, and say that he regretted it. No one likes to be compared with others by their parents or superiors, so Brenton naturally became jealous and curious about this guy Luo An. But after learning from Agent Norton about the number and time Luo An solved the case, Brenton fell silent. He was indeed not as good as Luo An, and there was no comparison. Being able to join the organized crime investigation division, and being valued by Dylan, Brenton naturally had qualified psychological and emotional regulation ability. So in the later work, Brenton chose to throw away jealousy, accumulate himself little by little, make fewer mistakes, and improve himself. This is the kingly way. But when attending the party today, the jealousy deep in Brenton's heart still jumped out. You have a strong ability to solve cases, so why are you so popular with women? In the whole party, besides Lassie, the second most popular person is Roan, and many women like to get close to Roan. In terms of solving cases, Brenton estimated that 10 of him would not be Roan's opponent. But playing American billiards is different. 10 Roans would not be his opponent. Brenton now wants to show his superb skills and crush Roan to realize his vanity. In addition, there are many female guests as spectators, and the vanity becomes stronger. Looking at the billiards on the table, Roan was silent for a few seconds, patted the shoulder of Agent Norton beside him, and agreed with a smile. Okay, but you need to explain the rules. Roan didn't know much about American billiards, but he was very familiar with Chinese billiards, and was very skilled. After all, some wealthy people like to play ball games, such as 10 million for a ball, and finally make a female star go to the hospital or something like that. In his previous life, the old killer had carefully taught Luo An the content of this kind of ball game. After mastering the skills of playing ball, Luo An learned more about the skills of using the cue and the ball itself to kill people. Seeing Luo An nod in agreement, Norton, who also reacted, walked to Brenton, patted Brenton's shoulder hard, and snorted coldly, Luo An doesn't know American billiards, you should give him some slack. Of course. Brandon smiled, seeing that more guests noticed the scene here. Not only did he explain the rules to Luo An seriously, but he also set the balls very professionally, and finally pointed at the billiard balls and smiled gracefully. You go first, I can guide you, if you make mistakes. Okay. Luo An grinned, picked up the cue, and fiddled with it for a few times, and directly used his greatest strength to knock all the diamond billiard balls away. Bang bang. After the billiard balls on the table rolled for a while, one of them rolled into the hole in a very magical way. Good. Roan, awesome. Norton and Riyadh, as well as Lassie, Mona, Leela and Celine, all applauded for Roan's direct goal. Brenton, who was standing by, also applauded with a smile. It was just the luck of a beginner. Roan stood up and asked with a smile, can we hit other numbers now? Yes. Brenton nodded indifferently. Roan glanced at the table and bent down again. The next ball he was going to hit was a blue ball. Everyone around frowned when they saw this, because there was a red ball next to the blue ball, blocking half of the route, making it difficult for the blue ball to enter the hole. This ball is blocked. Yes, it seems that the ball right will be given to Brenton. Roan waved his hand and poked the cue ball hard. Bang, bang, bang. 3 consecutive collisions were heard. The cue ball hit the blue ball, which hit another red ball. The red ball bounced off the edge of the table, hit the blue ball again, and then knocked the blue ball into the hole. The audience was stunned. Augustus was the fastest to react. He laughed loudly with his belly sticking out. Roan, you are so lucky. The others laughed too. Only Brandon's smile was a little stiff. He felt something was wrong. Roan didn't say anything and continued. The next target was the yellow ball. Bang. It went in successfully. Then the red ball. Bang. It went in again. Roan hit the billiard balls in order, and the power worked miracles. Several balls went directly into the hole, and only the 9th ball was left. Hualala seeing this scene, everyone applauded again and laughed. Ha ha ha. Roan is so lucky. Great. Roan. Great. This kind of ball can go in directly. Several ladies next to him shouted, come on, Roan. Score the last ball and beat Brenton. They also knew that Brenton was a former table tennis player. Brenton, who was standing aside, saw this scene, holding the club, standing stiffly in place, somewhat doubting his life. But before he could react, Roan successfully hit the number 9 ball into the hole. Bang. At the moment the sound rang out, Brenton, who had been a spectator the whole time, was a little dazed. Everyone around gave Roan a round of applause. Riyadh and Lassie, who knew him well, came over to praise him. Roan, you actually cleared the table with one shot. This is the first time I know you're so good at billiards. Why don't you stop working for the FBI and go pro? Amid the crowd's praise, Roan was very low-key. He waved his hand to indicate that it was all luck, then turned around to look at Brenton with a sunny smile on his face. How about it, Brenton? Do you want to continue? Brenton. Chapter 167. Post-event rewards and unexpected new cases. Monday, Investigation Team 5. Except for Mona who slept in the investigation team, the other agents have not come to work yet. Luo An came early today. He sat on a chair and was checking the light blue system page in his mind. In the past few days, the system gave him good and excellent evaluations most of the time. After the rough web game treasure chest opening animation every day, most of the potions opened in the system treasure chest were also physical potions, strength potions and agility potions. For this kind of potion, that can add a little bit of basic attributes every time, Luo An takes as many as he can get, and never has too much. On the 2 nights when the Park River Male Corpse case and Seaside Deep Pit serial murder case were solved, in addition to the above 3 potions, the system treasure chest also opened a hemostatic potion, an antidote potion and a new potion, Featherfall potion. Without the manual, Luo An didn't know what this Featherfall potion meant, so he had to put it in the warehouse column temporarily. If another bottle is opened in the future, drink one to try the specific effect. Since he developed the habit of drinking several bottles of stamina potion, strength potion and agility potion after breakfast every day, although Luo An opened a lot of potions, there were not many left in the warehouse. At this time, Luo An's system warehouse had 2 bottles of antidote potion, 3 bottles of hemostasis potion, 1 bottle of strength potion, 1 bottle of agility potion, 1 bottle of weakness potion, 1 bottle of aqua surge potion, 1 bottle of fire resistance potion, and 1 bottle of newly opened featherfall potion. There was also a bottle of sleep potion in the warehouse. After attending Augustus' wedding anniversary party on Saturday night, Luo An went to the barbecue party held by Riyadh's family on Sunday. As expected by Luo An, a lot of Texas faces that he had never seen before came to the party. These people came because they heard about Luo An's arm wrestling performance last time. With the blessing of strength potion and stamina potion, Luo An was naturally not afraid of these rednecks in front of him. After a rounds of fighting and defeating everyone, Luo An successfully went from being a good half-brother in Texas to a half-family member that Texas had never seen in the first half of his life. Luo An. After Luo An defeated everyone, several NYPDs directly handed Luo An a card. This is a certificate issued to some police families within the NYPD police department. If these police families accidentally make a small mistake, as long as they show the certificate and the situation is not serious, the NYPD will let them go. The human society in America is not only deeply rooted, but also directly exposed. The main reason for giving Luo An this certificate is that these NYPD rednecks heard about Luo An's love of racing. With this card, even if Luo An drives a Chevrolet to race, when he has no mission in the future, as long as nothing goes wrong, the NYPD will not come to trouble him. Luo An was very happy to get the card. The only problem next was that this group of people could drink too much. Luo An Greenwood's alcohol tolerance is average, and even with the blessing of various potions, the alcohol tolerance is not something that can be improved. What's more, a bunch of rednecks took turns to force him to drink. In the later stage, he couldn't drink anymore, and the group of people stopped him from leaving. Luo An had no choice but to pour the sleeping potion into the barrel while they were not paying attention. Half an hour later, the noise of the drunkards disappeared completely, replaced by the snoring that soared to the sky. Seeing this, the wives of the rednecks threw their husbands into the trunk and drove home with one foot on the accelerator. Not long after, just when Luo An calculated how many days it would take for the system treasure chest to open US dollars again, Lassie pushed open the door of the number 5 investigation team and walked in. Bang! Throwing a few packs of Luo An's favorite breakfast on the table in front of Luo An, Lassie whispered, "You did a good job." Luo An raised his head, his face full of confusion, and then suddenly remembered something. His pupils shrank suddenly, and he hurriedly shook his head. "I didn't touch you." Luo An had no sexual interest in lesbians. Nonsense. Hearing Roan's words, Lassie was stunned, and after reacting, she glared at him fiercely. Letting go of her hand, Lassie took out a business card and stuffed it into Roan's pocket, saying with an unhappy face, "If you don't want to struggle and want to get ahead in one step, just call this number." Roan's face was even more puzzled, and he picked up the business card and asked, "Who is this?" Lassie snorted coldly, "She is the female companion I brought to Augustus's party, Diana." At the party on Saturday night, when Roan asked Brandon if he wanted to continue, Brandon was silent for a while and chose to continue. In the subsequent process, he made several foul balls. That is, he used the rules reasonably and used his own ball to block Roan's forward ball. The men present thought that it was normal to use the rules reasonably in a competition, but the ladies were not so rational and complained to express their dissatisfaction. So in the end, although Valentine won Roan with 2 wins in 3 games, all the ladies present ran to Roan to comfort him. They all said that Valentine, as an athlete in the past, bullied Luo An, an amateur player, which was a case of bullying the weak and too despicable. Valentine wanted to cry, but had no tears. He was upset even though he won. Lassie's female companion Diana was also one of the ladies who comforted Luo An. After the party that night, Lassie and Diana went to a hotel, and then they fought on the bed because they both thought the other was Ling, and they were Yi. After more than an hour of fighting, Lassie was defeated and began to be forced to work. For a long time, Diana ate the fruit after the event with a comfortable face, and then suddenly came to Lassie and made a request. Call Luo An. She wanted to compete with Luo An in technology. Don't get me wrong. The technology here refers to American billiards. Diana's family is very rich, and her brother is a world-renowned American billiards player. Diana herself has no shortage of money, so she naturally has spiritual pursuits. That is, she wants to be world famous for American billiards like her brother. But she herself has average skills and no talent, so she finally chose to lower her life goal, marry an American billiard player. Luo An is not an American billiard player, but he has the skills of American billiards, and has a handsome face. Although he is a man, Diana doesn't care. It doesn't matter whether he is a man or a woman to her. After listening to Lass's narration, Luo An's eyes were full of speechless words. He was too lazy to care about this kind of woman who was popular with both men and women, and he didn't have the idea of becoming a son-in-law. Luo An threw the card into the trash can. After thinking for a long time, Luo An coughed twice and moved to Lassie to ask a question. That is, with Lass's experience, why didn't she distinguish the other party's role this time? Luo An was a little curious and wanted to learn some new knowledge. Bang! At this moment, the door of the number 5 investigation team was suddenly pushed open, and then Augustus's loud voice rang out, "Everyone." A new case suddenly came. It was not yet the specific working time. In the office area of the number 5 investigation team, Luo An, Lassie, Mona, and Augustus stared at each other. "Even if you have to work overtime this time, you will be paid overtime later." Augustus' mouth twitched when he saw the empty office area, but fortunately the key people in solving the case were all there, so he didn't waste any words and said directly, "A judge in the New York court was killed 10 minutes ago. You should go to the scene to check the situation now." "Okay, sir." Hearing that there was overtime pay, Luo An stood up with a serious face, pulled Lassie into the equipment warehouse, and then immediately drove to the crime scene. Chapter 168. A female judge was shot dead in front of a bakery. The crime scene was on Manhattan Island, not far from the Jacob Federal Building. Roan and Lassie reached the target location in just a few minutes. The SUV slowly stopped at the roadside. Roan and Lassie unbuckled their seat belts and jumped out of the car, walking quickly to the bakery across the street. The body was lying next to the car at the door of the bakery. "Hello, I'm Roan Greenwood." Seeing the cordon set up by the NYPD, Roan subconsciously prepared to take out the golden badge in his pocket and introduce himself. But just halfway through his words, the NYPD detective opposite turned around, walked over and patted Roan on the shoulder. "I didn't expect it to be you, Roan. This case was handed over to you." Seeing the smile on the detective's face, Roan also laughed. "It turned out to be you, Detective Walton." Detective Walton is a typical Texan. Yesterday, he happened to attend a barbecue party at Reed's house with Roan and even wrestled with Roan. After losing to Roan in arm wrestling, it was Detective Walton who gave Roan the card that only NYPD family members could get. After introducing Lass's identity and briefly chatting with Detective Walton, Roan glanced at the body covered with a white cloth on the ground and asked, "What's the situation at the scene?" The victim's name is Carolina Bellows, 65 years old, and she is one of the judges of the New York court. Speaking of business, Detective Walton's face was serious, with his hands on his hips. "That's why this case was handed over to you." The murder of the judge was not a small case, and the NYPD decisively chose to hand the case over to the FBI. Roan bent down and lifted the white cloth to check the body. Lassie continued to ask, "Was anything stolen?" "It doesn't look like it." Detective Walton shook his head. "The phone, wallet, ID, cash, and handbag are all there. No missing items were found." Lassie's face remained unchanged. "It doesn't look like a murder of passion caused by robbery." "That's right." Roan, who was next to the body, nodded in response. Then his eyes lit up and moved to the side of the car. Picking up two obviously used shells from under the car, Roan stood up and handed them to Detective Walton with a smile. "Please send someone to deliver them to the federal building later." "Okay." Detective Walton nodded and agreed, and pointed to a white young man surrounded by several NYPD officers not far behind him, and said, "He is the one who called the police, and is also a witness to the crime." Roan and Lassie thanked Walton and immediately walked to the white young man. "I was just planning to come to this bakery to buy something to eat." Seeing the FBI gold badges displayed by Roan and Lassie, the young man immediately replied, "I just walked past the corner of the street and heard 2 gunshots." I saw someone shot and fell to the ground, so I quickly called the police. You did a great job. Lassie took out a small notebook and expressed her affirmation of the young man while recording, and Roan continued to ask, did you see the face of the shooter clearly? No. The white young man shook his head, indicating that the murderer was wearing a mask and he couldn't see his face clearly at all. But the guy was wearing blue jeans, a black jacket and a grey hoodie. The young man added, pointing to the east of the bakery. After firing the gun, the guy ran towards that direction. Hearing the young man use he to describe the other party, Luo An continued to ask, are you sure that guy is a man? Yes. The young man said that the murderer shouted before firing the gun. It was a man's voice, and he couldn't have heard it wrong. What did the murderer shout? 2 sentences in total. I didn't hear the first one clearly. The young man spread his hands. The second sentence was, now it's your turn. Wow. Hearing this, Lassie paused writing, and Luo An crossed his hands over his chest. It looks like a revenge case. Investigation Team Number 5, Luo An and Lassie participated in the meeting discussion via mobile phones. Augustus stood at the front of the office area, holding a folder in his hand. He loudly introduced the basic information of the victim, then looked at William and asked, anything else to add? Carolina Bellows has been a judge for 6 years. William sat at his workstation and said while typing on the keyboard, but most of the cases she has been in charge of in the past 2 years are related to appeals in prison. So she faces criminals in prison. Augustus closed the folder. Has the victim received any threatening letters or been followed by anyone? There is a recorded case. Mona typed a few times on the keyboard, looked up and said, 14 months ago, a gang member threatened Carolina by sending her a bullet. But less than a month after that gang member was released from prison, he was beheaded because of a fight between gangs. What an unlucky guy. Augustus's cell phone suddenly rang, and he turned and walked into the conference room. Roan said on the other end of the phone, the death of a gang member doesn't mean that others have no grudges against Carolina. Some people can wait until they are released from prison to retaliate against her. Yeah. All the detectives from Investigation Team 5 nodded. Although there is no original saying in the West that a gentleman's revenge is never too late, there are similar sentences with the same meaning. Let's continue investigating the cases Carolina has handled recently. Luo An sat in the car, remotely controlling the next investigation direction of the detectives of Investigation Team 5, and then asked, Mona, how is the surveillance near the crime scene going? Only the camera in the flower shop next to the bakery recorded a little bit of the content at the time of the crime. The surveillance in other places did not find the murderer. Mona showed the surveillance footage to the detectives of Investigation Team 5. Luo An and Lassie couldn't see it, so she briefly described the situation in the surveillance, and finally concluded, Carolina was driving a Jaguar, so it can be inferred that the murderer is about 1.8 meters tall. As for other content, I'm sorry, the clarity of the flower shop surveillance is average, and the murderer is wearing a mask. I can't find any other useful information for the time being. Okay. Luo An didn't say much. He pondered for a few seconds, and continued to ask, how is the victim's family, such as financial status, marital relationship, etc. Mona tapped the keyboard quickly a few times, then frowned. Carolina's husband died in a car accident 2 years ago. Her 2 daughters are a lawyer and a coffee shop owner. But the lawyer daughter suddenly disappeared a year ago, and her whereabouts are unknown. The coffee shop owner's daughter became addicted to drugs 2 years ago, and died of an overdose 6 months ago. What? After hearing Mona's description, and thinking of the murderer's words, it's your turn now, the detectives of the number 5 investigation team were all stunned. Lassie and the sub also looked confused. Roan was silent for a moment and asked seriously, so, Carolina's family has been wiped out now, right? No. Mona on the other end of the phone reported an address and said, Carolina Bellows has another sister alive in the world. She has been living with Carolina for nearly a year. Okay. After asking Mona and the detectives of the number 5 investigation team to dig deep into all the information about Carolina, Roan hung up the phone, started the SUV, stepped on the accelerator, and rushed towards Carolina's sister's house. Chapter 169 Fingerprints. Upon learning that her sister had been attacked and killed not long ago, Carolina Bellows' sister, and Liz Bellows, sat in a wheelchair and cried silently. Seeing the elderly woman who was about to turn 70 sobbing and crying, Lassie quickly took out a tissue and handed it to her. After Liz's emotions gradually stabilized, Roan asked in a low voice, "Can you tell me about Carolina's situation?" After a long silence, Liz sighed repeatedly. "Carolina is a good person. She is a kind person and has never had a conflict with anyone in her life. It doesn't matter whether this is true or not." Anyway, Lassie took out a small notebook and wrote it down, and Roan continued to ask, "In recent days, have you felt that Carolina is a little anxious, a little worried, or there is something else wrong?" "No." And Liz shook her head repeatedly. "Everything has been very normal in recent days, so I'm very shocked and don't understand why someone wants to kill her." Seeing that the old man in front of her was about to be out of breath, Lassie hurriedly poured her a glass of water, smoothed her back and comforted her. "We understand that this kind of thing has always been difficult for people to accept, but we need to know more information about Carolina. Only in this way can we catch the murderer who killed Carolina." I know. After drinking the water handed over by Lassie, Liz calmed down again. After thinking for a moment, she suddenly remembered something and looked at Luo An and said seriously, "Last week, because of my physical disability, Carolina said she would hire a nanny for me, but she was afraid that the nanny would not work well, cheat her or bully me, so she asked someone to install surveillance cameras in various places in this apartment, including the lawn outside the house." Hearing this news, Lassie's eyes lit up immediately. Luo An didn't waste any words and stood up and asked, "Where is the surveillance terminal?" Not long after, the surveillance video appeared in front of Luo An. After excluding those blank and useless clips, Luo An successfully found a guy wearing a mask in the record of Friday afternoon. The style of the mask worn by this guy is exactly the same as the mask style of the murderer who killed Carolina. Looking up and making eye contact with Lassie, Roan immediately exported the surveillance records and then asked Liz, "Do you know him?" Looking at the screenshots of the photos in the video, Liz thought for a few seconds and nodded repeatedly. "I don't know him, but I have seen him. He has been wandering around this apartment many times in the past few days. He exudes a weird feeling. When I was sitting on the lawn basking in the sun, he kept staring at me." Hearing this, Roan hurriedly asked, "Then did you see his face clearly?" "No, he was wearing a mask at the time, just like in the photo." And Liz suddenly came to her senses, looked at Roan anxiously, and asked, "Is he the murderer of Carolina?" "Damn, I should have thought of it earlier. I always thought he was a homeless person. I should have said it earlier and told Carolina the news earlier so that she wouldn't." As she spoke, Liz sobbed again. Roan sighed when she saw this, and Lassie took out tissues again to comfort her. Investigation Team Number 5, Office Area. Luo An sat back at his workstation and took a big gulp of coffee. The bitter taste rushed straight to his brain. Luo An pursed his lips and wanted to ask Augustus, when will he get a new coffee machine, now that the money has been received. Okay, this is the person who was stalking outside Carolina Bellows' apartment. After sorting out the surveillance video that Roan brought back, Mona quickly made a comparison chart with the appearance of the murderer at the crime scene, compared with the height of the trees outside the apartment. The two people are the same height, and their walking postures are very similar, with the center of gravity on the right heel. Very good. Augustus patted his big belly and nodded with satisfaction. It seems that this guy should be the murderer of Carolina Bellows. He planned this case in advance, then monitored Carolina, understood the pattern of her daily life, and finally implemented his plan this morning. But I can't find this guy's identity. Mona's 10 fingers danced quickly on the keyboard, and the crackling sound was endless. But after a few minutes, Mona still sighed in disappointment, looked at Augustus and said, "This guy wore a mask the whole time, and the surveillance near Carolina's apartment couldn't see his face clearly. And I haven't found any signs that the other party drove. The guy always walked into a park and then disappeared completely." Hearing Mona's words, Augustus frowned, then looked at William and asked loudly, "How is it? Have you found anyone who may threaten Carolina or have a grudge against Carolina?" "Sir, there are too many people." William and others smiled bitterly. Carolina Bellos is a judge and has to deal with dozens of cases every day. Even if those ordinary civil cases are excluded, the cases handled by Carolina every day can fill more than 10 pages. Looking for suspects from the perspective of hatred alone is like looking for a needle in a haystack. Augustus also thought of this, and his expression became even uglier. The death of a judge by shooting has caused a huge impact. Many large and small media in New York have turned their attention here. In the past, Augustus was not panicked because Verines, the team leader, was in the front. But now Verines is still lying in the hospital, and Augustus naturally needs to take the lead. Thinking of those messy media who dare to ask anything, as well as the attention of Special Agent Director Corbett, Augustus was under great pressure. But as the leader of the 5th investigation team, it is his job to resist pressure, so Augustus did not choose to transfer the pressure to agents such as Roan and Mona, but chose to bear it all by himself. After a long silence, Augustus turned his eyes to Roan, who was thinking with his head down, and wanted to ask him what he was thinking next. At this moment, Riyad pushed open the door of the investigation team and walked in. "Sir." Seeing that all the agents turned their eyes to him, Riyad raised the folder in his hand and smiled. "The two shells that Roan picked up at the crime scene. The trace examination department found half a fingerprint behind one of them. Using the database, we successfully matched a guy, Aval Miller. Well done." Augustus patted his big belly happily, threw a pair of admiring eyes to Roan, and then looked at Mona. Mona has always been very reliable. She quickly found the suspect's information and showed it to everyone. Aval Miller, 43 years old, participated in several wars when he was young. After retiring and returning to the Federation, he has been in and out of prison for a host of crimes including shooting, threatening witnesses, drug crimes, intentional injury, etc. The time spent in prison is much longer than the time outside. After reading the information and learning from Mona the current address of Aval Miller, Roan immediately got up and took Riyad to the equipment warehouse. In the equipment warehouse, Riyad did not take more extended magazines of Glock 18 as usual, but replaced them all with stun grenades. Riyad even took more stun grenades than Roan. Roan on the side. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 172 Shots in the chest and one in the head. Aval Miller lives in a community called Fordham in the western part of the Bronx. It is mainly populated by Latinos and blacks, with a small number of whites and almost no Asians. In addition, the birth rate of underage mothers in this area is higher than in other areas and communities in New York. Later, this area was called one of the top 10 dangerous areas in New York. After entering the night, the NYPD did not like to come to this area, which shows that the people are simple, free and harmonious. However, the scene in this area during the day looks okay. Fully armed, Roan drove Ryder into this community and saw many roadside stalls selling things and some black children running around on the street. Be careful later, Roan. Seeing the ease and calmness on Roan's face, Ryder, who was sitting in the co-pilot seat, silently grasped the Glock 18 in his hand and whispered, "This area does not welcome the NYPD, let alone the FBI." Ryder said that he was not a racist, but it was an indisputable fact that the crime rate was high in places with many blacks. The Fordham community was not very large, but there were more than a dozen black gangs. "Don't be nervous, Ryder. You have to trust the equipment we both have." Roan turned the steering wheel and drove the SUV into another street, smiling and patting his weapons. As usual, Roan was wearing combat uniforms, a plate-carrying vest on his chest, several bags on his waist, stuffed with 10 stun grenades and 10 extended magazines, and 2 Glock 18s in his holsters. Ryder's equipment was similar to Roan's. After assessing the two skills, as long as the gangsters didn't ambush them at the same time and place, the remaining problems would not be big. Seeing the calmness on Roan's face, Ryder's mood slowly calmed down. Bullets are the anchor, and the equipment on the body is the iron. Now all the agents of the number 5 investigation team have a subconscious confidence in Roan, and Ryder is no exception. After moving forward for a few minutes again, The SUV slowly stopped next to a dilapidated 2-story building. After opening the door and getting out of the car, some passers-by saw Roan and Riyadh, who were fully armed, and decisively chose to leave here and take a detour. One of the survival wisdoms of living here is not to be curious plus stay away from troublesome things that look dangerous. This small building is a hotel. Riyadh pushed the door and entered. Just as he was about to ask the black boss at the front desk, Roan sniffed his nose, frowned, looked around the layout of the hotel, and suddenly took out a pistol and pointed it at the other party. Riyadh was stunned and immediately raised his pistol subconsciously. But at the moment when Riyadh raised his arm, although the black boss didn't know why he was exposed so quickly, he chose to take action without hesitation and immediately took out a pistol from under the table. Bang, bang. 3 gunshots. The black boss just made a move, and Roan decisively pulled the trigger. 2 bullets hit the chest, and 1 bullet hit the head. The black boss closed his eyes and collapsed backwards on the ground. Rider. After successfully sending the black boss away, Roan quickly pulled Riyadh and hid behind the front desk. Bang, bang, bang. Sure enough, in the next second, a series of bullets were fired from the stairs, hitting the place where the two had just stood. Ignoring the slippery feeling brought by the black boss's blood, although he didn't know what happened, the experienced Riyadh immediately raised his pistol and fired back at the other party. Not only that, Riyadh also learned Roan's skills. Taking advantage of the gap, he took out a stun grenade from his waist and threw it over. Bang! Dazzling white light and deafening explosions suddenly broke out in the stairwell, and the enemy who fired the gun immediately wailed. Well done, Roan, who successfully found the room where Ava Miller lived in the notes on the front desk, patted Riyadh's shoulder with satisfaction, and then stretched out his hand to signal him to look at the cabinet he opened. Riyadh looked back and saw the body of a Latino girl lying in the cabinet with her eyes open. Obviously, this girl was the front desk of the hotel. The blood smell is too strong. My nose is more sensitive. After explaining casually, facing Riyadh's admiring eyes, Roan said the room where Ava Miller was, and then whispered, call for support, quick battle and quick decision. Okay. After receiving the order, Riyadh immediately pressed the communicator, and Roan stood up and jumped over the front desk. At this time, there were several black youths lying on the stairs wailing, and several black youths were bending over to pull them upstairs. Seeing Roan's figure, the faces of the black youths bending over to pull people changed, and all raised their weapons at Roan. Before these people could react, Roan threw another stun grenade towards the stairs at the moment he jumped over the table. Bang! The moment the stun grenade exploded, Roan immediately pulled the trigger of the Glock 18. Bang, bang, bang. A series of gunshots rang out, and the stairs were immediately covered with watermelon juice. Riyadh completed the task of calling for support and ran to Roan's side. Standing at the staircase on the first floor, Luo An threw 2 stun grenades upstairs again, then raised his left hand and waved it, saying without any nonsense, you go left, I go right. No problem. Riyadh stood in front of Luo An and rushed to the second floor quickly. He first shot down 2 black men who were about to attack him, and then moved towards the rooms on the left side of the second floor. Luo An walked up to the second floor with an expressionless face, hid by the wall at the staircase, pointed his gun at the black man with a gun, who was knocked down by Riyadh on the ground, but didn't know whether he was dead or not, and pulled the trigger to choose to finish him off. The other party still had a gun in his hand, and Luo An didn't want himself and Riyadh to be stabbed in the back by these guys because of a momentary negligence. However, Luo An's finishing blow was not to the heads of these black men, but to their left and right chests. After the incident today, he and Riyadh will definitely be questioned and investigated. If he finished off these people with a shot to smash their heads, it would give some guys who had been eyeing Luo An a reason to blame him. Luo An always likes to look a few steps ahead when doing things, especially now that Verines is still lying in the hospital. After changing to a new magazine, Roan disappeared in a flash, and the whole person checked every room on the right side of the corridor at a rapid speed. The first few rooms were empty until Roan got closer and closer to the room where Ava Miller was, and a sturdy black man holding a submachine gun suddenly jumped out. Seeing Roan, who was a head shorter than him, the sturdy black man grinned. The flames from the muzzle roared out. Bang, bang. 3 gunshots, and the sturdy black man's face froze. The next moment, the sturdy black man's hands and feet were numb, and his limbs lost control. The submachine gun that had not been fired in time fell to the ground powerlessly. Looking at the body of the sturdy black man, Roan blew on the muzzle of the Glock 18, lowered his head and spit. "You look so ugly, what are you laughing at?" Walking into the room in a vigilant posture, there was a white man with a gunshot in the chest lying on the ground, and the window of the room had been completely shattered. The white man was not Ava Miller, but his face was somewhat similar to him. He walked to the window and checked the glass fragments. He found that they were from the inside to the outside. Roan judged that someone must have jumped out of the room and escaped. Roan turned around and just bent down to check the injuries of the white man on the ground to see if he was dead or not. Suddenly, the other party spurted out a mouthful of blood and struggled to whisper, "Help." Chapter 171 Mental Status Assessment. At this moment, Riyad, who had finished checking the left side of the second floor, also entered the room. "Call an ambulance quickly." The white man's face was somewhat similar to Av Miller's. Thinking of the mess at the scene, Roan immediately judged that he was of great use and could not die here. "Okay." Seeing Riyad press the communicator and begin to briefly describe the situation here, Roan tilted his head and thought about it, then took out his mobile phone from his pocket, found a phone number, and dialed it. A few hours later, in the office area of the 5th Investigation Team, after confirming several times that Roan's body was indeed not injured, Mona breathed a sigh of relief. After patting Roan's arm hard, Mona sat back at her workstation and read out the information about Roan rescuing the white man. That guy's name is Edwin Miller, and he's Av Miller's distant cousin. He's 40 years old this year. He was a soldier when he was young. After returning to the Federation, he has never been to jail, but his recent financial situation is very bad. He needs to pay $3,000 a month for support for his ex-wife and son. But he just lost his job last month. After listening to Mona's narration, Roan laughed and sat back in his chair. Lassie came over, put her arm around Mona's slender waist, and whispered, "Hey, Mona, Ryder was also a participant in the gunfight just now. Don't you want to ask about his situation?" Mona rolled her eyes, gently broke free from Lassie's arms, glared at Roan, and whispered, "Ryder has Ivan to take care of him." Hearing this, Lassie's smile became even bigger. Just as she was about to speak, Augustus suddenly pushed open the door and walked in. Behind him were two white men and women in suits, holding folders and looking expressionless. Seeing the man and woman, all the detectives of the 5th Investigation Team frowned and stood up, looking at Riyad and Roan. Especially Roan. "It's the security department of the Human Resources Department." Lassie frowned, "But why are they here now?" Just like the Internal Affairs Department in the NYPD, whose job is to supervise the police in the NYPD and punish the police who violate the rules and laws, the Security Department of the Human Resources Department has the job of supervising the agents and officers in the FBI. Both are unpopular departments. Just now, Roan and Riyad, two senior FBI agents, were not SWAT members, but they killed a large number of enemies together. Afterwards, they will definitely be questioned by his security department to judge their mental state. The detectives of the 5th Investigation Team have been prepared for this kind of thing. But the inquiry is usually after the case is solved, not when the case is just halfway through. What's going on? The detectives of the 5th Investigation Team all cast a questioning look at August. Mona also showed a worried look to Roan. Augustus didn't say much, just gave Roan a look, then waved his hand. "Roan, Riyad, go with them." "Okay, sir." Hearing Augustus' words, Roan and Riyad looked at each other and nodded in agreement. Patting Mona on the back, Roan threw a smile to the agents and calmly left the office area of Investigation Team 5. Seeing the backs of Roan and Riyad leaving, Lassie clenched her fists and her face was solemn. Looking back at Mona, she found that Mona sat back in the chair and started typing on the keyboard again. Lassie was slightly stunned and asked hurriedly, "Mona, you believe in Roan?" The moment she saw the smile on Roan's face, Mona put down the stone in her heart. She knew that Roan never did anything without preparation. But having said that, Mona still stared at the door of Investigation Team 5 like Lassie. Human Resources Department, Security Department, Interrogation Room. The Security Department is next to the Training Department. When Roan walked out of the elevator, he also saw Old York, a senior agent in the training department. Chapter 3. Sitting on the chair, Roan looked at the agent across the table with a strange expression. He used to interrogate others, but now he was being interrogated by others. It felt quite strange. "Hello, Agent Roan Greenwood." The white man in a suit put the folder on the table and introduced himself, and the woman expressionlessly, "My name is Notting." Her name is Nettie, from the security department of the human resources department. "Hello." Roan smiled and nodded. The two sides exchanged a few pleasantries, and soon Notting got to the point. "Agent Greenwood, according to the subsequent investigation of the trace examination department, there were a total of 13 bodies at the scene of the crime, and 9 of them were killed by you, right? Including the 2 bodies that were killed." The number was correct. But Roan did not answer or nod, but crossed his legs and asked with a smile, "Then what?" Seeing Roan's action, Nettie's face changed, his eyes widened, and he said sternly, "Agent Roan, you, ahem." Nettie didn't finish her words, and Notting on the side coughed twice, and then continued expressionlessly, "In view of the fact that you have killed too many enemies in a short period of time in this case, we are now going to evaluate your mental state. Please listen carefully to my questions and answer yes or no." After that, Notting opened the folder, took out a piece of paper, and asked the first question. Nettie on the side saw this scene, and opened her mouth, wanting to say something, but didn't dare to say it. Staring at the face of Agent Notting opposite him, and thinking about Augustus's eyes just now, after a long silence, Roan suddenly laughed, then put away his legs, and began to answer the other party's questions. A few minutes later, Agent Notting nodded with satisfaction, drew a big check mark on the paper, then stood up, and held out his hand to Roan. "Congratulations, Agent Notting, you have passed this mental status assessment. Thank you very much for your cooperation." "Thank you, Agent Notting, you have worked hard too." Roan stretched out his hand and shook hands with the other party. He glanced at Nettie, whose face was flushed, and smiled as he pushed open the door of the interrogation room and walked out. In the corridor, Ryder had been waiting for a long time. When he saw Roan coming out, he hurried over to greet him. Based on past experience, Ryder judged that he would be questioned for at least a few hours. He didn't understand why it was so fast this time. It felt like he had just sat down, and he came out. In the interrogation room, Nettie saw through the glass door that Roan patted Ryder on the shoulder and walked towards the elevator with a smile on his face. She finally couldn't help it and turned around and asked with a red face, "Sir, what's going on? This is not in line with our regulations at all." After casually stuffing Roan's mental evaluation test into the folder, when she heard Nettie's question, Notting raised his head expressionlessly, took out his mobile phone, and handed it to the other party. "This is the number of our deputy director." Nettie's face froze, and she stood there in a daze. Not only that, Notting pulled down the phone records, pointed to another phone number and said, "This is a call from Washington." Hearing this, Nettie shuddered and her eyes widened. Seeing Roan and Ryder return to investigation team number 5 so quickly, Mona was relieved, while Lassie and others stood up in shock. "Why did you come back so soon?" Hearing this, Roan sat back in his chair and said unhappily, "Why, do you want me to stay there for a few more days?" "That's not what I meant." Lassie waved her hands hurriedly, and at this moment, Mona on the side suddenly turned around and said, "Everyone, I found out the identities of the group of blacks killed by Roan. Not only that, Edwin Miller just woke up. He said he has important clues and hopes to see the FBI as soon as possible." Chapter 172 All Villains. Investigation Team Number 5, Office Area. Everyone looked at Mona, waiting for her next words. That group of black people are members of the Cigar Gang, a small black gang in the Fordham community. Mona tapped the keyboard a few times and showed everyone the information in the computer. "Agent Norton from the Organized Crime Investigation Division just sent me a document. It shows that the Cigar Gang is trying to expand its ruling area recently." Roan took a sip of coffee. "It's really not surprising." "Yeah." Mona nodded, and then suddenly laughed. "But because of you and Ryder, the Cigar Gang will probably be destroyed soon." Roan paused. "What do you mean?" When the others heard this, they were also confused. Mona didn't keep the secret and explained with a smile. The cigar gang was established not long ago and has a small number of people. A large part of the people you killed were core members of the cigar gang. Now that the core members are dead, the leader of the cigar gang has recently offended many other gangs in nearby areas in order to expand his territory, so the detective suddenly realized and then looked at Roan with admiration again. Roan raised his eyebrows. He didn't expect that this action would have such an effect. He planned to go back and talk to Norton from the Organized Crime Investigation Department to see if there was anything he could get. However, the fight between the gangs can be put aside for now. The murder of the female judge is more important now. So Roan looked at Mona and asked again, have you found out why those guys from the cigar gang met with Aval Miller in the hotel? No. Mona shook her head, indicating that she didn't find out, but Edwin Miller had woken up, and he must know the reason behind it. In the hospital, hearing Roan's question, Edwin Miller, who was lying on the bed, endured the pain from the wound, and explained with a grim face, this is because Aval is doing business with those blacks. Edwin said that Aval got a batch of weapons from somewhere some time ago, and then planned to sell them to the cigar gang. Today is a day when Aval and the cigar gang meet to discuss the price. Meeting in the hotel was also Aval's idea. But unexpectedly, as soon as they met today, the blacks took out guns and pointed them at Aval and Edwin, intending to use their brothers' lives in exchange for the batch of weapons. Lassie, who was standing aside, was speechless. But thinking about it carefully, this behavior is in line with the behavior habits of blacks. Roan was not surprised by this. When doing business with gangs, you must always be prepared for the other party to have the idea of black eating black, especially when the other party is a gang that has just been established and is composed of low-level blacks. After swiping a few times on the small notebook, Roan asked, you said before that you had important clues to tell us. What are the clues? Sanderdane, asterisk asterisk asterisk. Hearing Roan's question, Edwin immediately reported a name and a string of numbers, and then gritted his teeth and said firmly, this is the fake identity that Aval bought, and the social security number of this fake identity. You must catch him and send him to prison. Edwin is a veteran. He fought for this country when he was young, and after returning home, he has always abided by the laws of this country. But some time ago, he lost his job and could not pay the high alimony on time. Edwin had no choice but to rely on his cousin who had been in and out of prison for these years, hoping to make some extra money with his help. What made Edwin happy was that Aval agreed without hesitation and did not treat him as an outsider at all, showing him everything. But what made Edwin angry was that the reason why Aval did not treat him as an outsider was that he did not want him to live at all, but regarded him as a human shield for this transaction. Today, the two met with the cigar gang. Edwin was very nervous when he learned that the cigar gang was planning to rob the gang. However, Aval was not panicked at all. Hearing the gunshots from downstairs, Aval immediately pushed Edwin to the muzzle of the cigar gang's gun, and then broke the glass and jumped down from the second floor to escape. After listening to Edwin's narration and looking at his dark face, Roan and Lassie looked at each other and saw the speechless look in each other's eyes. As expected, Aval Miller has been to prison more times than he has been home. After writing his name and social security number in the small notebook, Roan was silent for a few seconds, raised his head and briefly described the general situation of the judge being shot in front of the bakery, and then asked, next to the body, we found 2 9mm bullets with Aval's fingerprints on them. What does this case have to do with Aval? Edwin Miller opened his mouth, but did not speak, lowered his head and kept silent. Roan narrowed his eyes slightly when he saw this, and Lassie's face beside him also became serious. It seems that there are other situations behind this. After hesitating for a long time, Edwin licked his cracked lips and looked up at Roan and Lassie. Before I say this, I ask you to give me full immunity in this case. Lassie raised her eyebrows. She didn't expect that Edwin was involved in this case. She turned to look at Roan, who put away his notebook and grinned. That depends on whether the information you said is useful. If the information you said can help us solve this case, we will fight for you in front of the judge. Okay. After a long silence, Edwin took a long breath and said in a deep voice, "After Aval showed me the batch of weapons he got, I stole 10 pistols and a bunch of bullets there. And I sold them secretly without Aval's knowledge." The reason why Edwin asked Ronan Lassie to give him immunity was that if he concealed it now, he would still be exposed after the FBI caught Aval later. Because although Aval had been in and out of prison many times, he had never sold guns alone, and it was the first time he negotiated with the cigar gang. On the other hand, it was Edwin Miller who loaded the gun. In the legal sense, he is an accomplice to the murder. If he tells this now, Edwin still has a reason to talk to the judge and court. If he keeps it secret and the FBI still finds out about it, Edwin will be in trouble in the future. Edwin, who is 40 years old and has relived the torture of life and death again, now just wants to live well for the rest of his life. After listening to Edwin's description, Lassie rolled her eyes. There is no good person in the whole story. Luo An didn't care about this matter and asked directly, "Do you remember who you sold those guns and ammunition to?" "Of course." Edwin nodded. "I'm very cautious about this matter. I used paper and pen to record the time and place of each transaction." "Good." Throwing the notebook to Lassie, Luo An patted his thigh and stood up from the chair. "We need this notebook." Edwin cooperated very well. "No problem." That night, because the case was serious and received much attention from the society, the number 5 investigation team was forced to work overtime. As for Aval Miller, the 5th investigation team handed his information to the Special Pursuit Division under the Major Events Group, and they were responsible for hunting him down. Roan took a bite of the customized hamburger thrown by Augustus, looked at Mona, and asked, "How is it? Did you find anything?" Mona shook her head. She was looking for something. "Thank you for your hard work." Patting Mona on the shoulder, Roan was about to hand her another hamburger when William, who was not far away, suddenly slapped the table and shouted excitedly, "I found a clue." Chapter 173 The Sin in the Refrigerator. The sudden noise and movement startled everyone, and Lassie almost spilled the coffee in her hand. Roan threw a bite of the burger on the table and walked quickly to William. "What did you find?" "We found a car." William tapped the keyboard a few times and then showed the computer to Roan. Inside were screenshots of several surveillance videos. "According to the transaction records you brought back, several of us technicians carefully checked the surveillance videos near the transaction location." Picking up the big burger and taking a big bite, William explained with a smile on his face, "Near one of the transaction locations, we found an orange pickup truck. Then we checked the area near the bakery where Carolina Bellos was killed, and the area near the apartment where her sister lived. When Carolina was killed, and when the masked guy appeared near the apartment, this orange pickup truck appeared nearby. Once is a coincidence, twice is accidental, and 3 times is not necessarily the case." "Well done." After patting William's shoulder, Roan immediately took Reed into the equipment warehouse and asked, "Who is the owner of the car?" "The boss of Henry Wood Plank Factory." At 6:30 p.m., Roan and Reed, fully armed, arrived at the wood plank factory. It was time to get off work, and the factory was empty. Only the boss's office was still lit. According to Mona's investigation, the financial situation of this wood plank factory was not very good. It looked like it would go bankrupt in a few months. "Dong dong dong, come in." The bald boss of the wood plank factory was looking at the financial statements in front of him with a worried look on his face. Hearing someone knocking on the door, he let the person in without raising his head. Then he saw Reed, who was fully armed, holding a Glock 18, and pointing at him. Swish. The bald boss's face suddenly changed, and he immediately stood up and raised his French military posture. After a moment, knowing the purpose of Roan and the others' visit, the bald boss immediately sat back on his chair and let out a long breath. "That car is indeed mine." The bald boss flipped through the employee information on the side with trembling hands and explained, "But for work, that car has been driven by my employees recently." Picking up the financial report on the table and looking at it, Luo An raised his eyebrows and asked, "Who is driving?" "What's his name?" "Georgian Landry." After successfully finding a piece of information, the bald boss handed it to Luo An and said, "A guy who makes people feel at ease." Taking the information, Luo An looked at the photo on it and found that it was a handsome white man. Indicating Ryder to send the above information to Mona, Luo An asked, "Reliable? How do you mean?" The bold boss said that the finances of his own factory were handled by Georgian Landry and his company's finances, which helped him save a lot of money every month. Looking down at some details of the financial report in his hand, and learning that the factory's finances were the boss's biological daughter, Luo An immediately smacked his lips. Things like cheating fathers really don't distinguish between nationalities, let alone men and women. Without saying much, after confirming that Riyad had sent all the information to Mona, Roan was ready to leave here, and he did not forget to leave his contact information for the bald boss, and added, if Georgian Landry contacts you, or comes to you, call me immediately. But at the same time, don't tell him that we have been here, okay? Okay. The bold boss nodded and agreed. Before the office door was closed, he said loudly, I don't know what Georgian did to attract the attention of your FBI, but believe me, he is a good man. Roan paused, shook his head, and strode away with Riyad. After catching Georgian Landry, contact the bold boss again, and ask him to find a third-party accountant to audit the accounts of his factory. Georgian Landry, 30 years old, was born in Brooklyn, New York, and never went to college. The dark Suv sped under the light of the street lamps. Mona on the other end of the phone was typing on the keyboard while carefully introducing the relevant information of Georgian Landry. When he was just an adult, Georgian Landry joined the army and served as a naval scout for 4 years. He also participated in many wars. After retiring, he passed the accounting certificate exam with his own efforts. He currently lives in Queens and has a bedridden mother at home. Very good. He looks like a well-trained soldier who successfully returned home from the battlefield after completing the mission. Turning the steering wheel, driving the Suv to overtake in the traffic with ease, Roan continued to ask, but we still don't know why he killed Carolina. Mona, have you found any connection between Georgian and Carolina? Judging from the crime scene, Carolina doesn't seem to be a random person, and Georgian's living conditions and thinking are not like those of those guys who take revenge on society. Mona on the other end of the phone looked unhappy. She quickly typed on the keyboard and frowned as she answered, I don't know. I'm still looking. The clues of the orange pickup truck were found by William and other technical agents first. Mona was a little unhappy now. But Mona was not targeting William and others, but herself. Okay, tell me when you find out. After hanging up the phone, Roan turned to Ryder, who was sitting in the passenger seat. Seeing that he was silently fastening his seatbelt, Roan grinned and asked, how about it, Ryder? Do you have any ideas? No. Ryder shook his head. From the information, Georgian Landry has nothing to do with this case. Did we find the wrong person? Maybe. Driving the Suv over another car, Roan suddenly remembered something, took out his cell phone again, and called Lassie. A few seconds later, the phone was connected. This is Lassie. Without any unnecessary nonsense, Roan said directly, Lassie, take Georgian Landry's photo, and go to the hospital, to find Edwin Miller to ask if he is the one who bought the gun. Okay. After hanging up the phone, Lassie immediately got up, and left the number 5 investigation team. A few minutes later, Roan and Ryder arrived at Georgian Landry's home smoothly. Parking the Suv diagonally opposite the house, Roan and Ryder carefully checked their equipment and made sure that everything was fine. They opened the door and got out of the car. Dong dong dong. Standing at the door on the left and right, Ryder knocked on the door and shouted loudly, FBI. Is anyone home? There was silence, and no one answered. Roan tentatively fiddled with the door handle, and the door of the house was opened by him smoothly. Looking at each other, the two raised their Glock 18s and walked quickly into the house. After searching every room in the house quickly, Roan soon found an old woman lying on the bed with her eyes closed and sleeping in the leftmost room on the second floor. Remembering that there was a paralyzed mother in the bed in Georgian Landry's file, Roan walked up to her and felt her breath to confirm that she was just sleeping and not dead. At this moment, Ryder's shouting suddenly came from downstairs. Roan, come to me. Hearing this, Roan hurriedly ran into the basement of the house in the direction of the voice and asked, what's wrong? Ryder did not answer, but pointed to the corner of the basement with a shocked face. Following Ryder's finger, Roan saw a working refrigerator. There was a frozen head in the refrigerator. If it was just a head, it would not shock Ryder so much. After all, he had seen this scene in the previous case. The real reason for Ida's shock was that the head and Jojen Landry's face were very similar. Chapter 174. 6 photos, 4 red crosses. In the basement, Roan walked to the refrigerator and checked the other compartments of the refrigerator. He found nothing. The huge refrigerator was only used to freeze this one item. Walking to Roan's side, Ryder carefully looked at the face in the refrigerator with a complicated expression. "Roan, what do you think?" "I don't know." Roan shook his head. The scene in front of him was beyond his expectations. However, seeing the face similar to that of Jorgen Landry, Roan had several guesses in his mind. But guesses are guesses, and evidence must be found. Thinking of this, Roan took out his mobile phone and prepared to make a call. One is to ask the number 5 investigation team to quickly send SWAT members to this area to wait. Maybe Jorgen Landry can be caught later. The second is to call the trace examination department and ask them to come here to deal with the head and search the house for evidence. Before Roan pressed the button on the mobile phone, the sound of the door opening suddenly came from above their heads. Ryder and Roan looked at each other without saying a word and immediately raised the Glock 18 and rushed out in a vigilant posture. "FBI, don't move." The person who appeared in front of the two was not Jorgen Landry, but a middle-aged white woman. Seeing the weapons in Roan and Reed's hands, the white woman hurriedly dropped her pockets and raised her hands in horror. "I'm the nanny here." A few minutes later, Roan and Reed successfully verified the nanny's identity and confirmed that she was not lying. After simply calming the nanny's emotions, Roan began to ask questions about Jorgen Landry. The nanny didn't know Jorgen Landry. She just came here at a few fixed times every day to help Jorgen Landry's mother deal with hygiene issues, and the rest of the time she worked in other people's homes. As for Jorgen Landry's mother, who was always sleeping, the nanny said that it was because his mother had some mental problems and needed to take medicine continuously, and the side effect of the medicine was falling into a deep sleep. After listening to the nanny's story, Roan continued to ask, "When Jorgen Landry asked you to be his nanny, did he tell you any requirements in advance?" "Indeed." The nanny nodded. Jorgen Landry had said before that she was not allowed to go to other rooms except her mother's room, bathroom, and kitchen. The nanny didn't care about this request. She had been a nanny for more than 10 years and had seen more outrageous requests than this. Hearing this, Roan suddenly remembered that he had just been called to the basement by Ryder and had not had time to search Jorgen Landry's room. After briefly explaining a few words to the nanny, Roan and Ryder immediately got up and went upstairs. The room on the far right of the second floor was Jorgen Landry's bedroom. In addition to a large bed and a wardrobe, there was also a desk and a bookshelf. The two carefully searched for a while, and Ryder successfully found a few Playboy magazines under the bed. Fouquet. Seeing the white genetic gene in the magazine, Ryder's face was ugly, and he cursed in a low voice and threw the magazine aside in a hurry. Feeling that his hands were dirty, Ryder took a deep breath, turned around, and found that Roan was carefully examining the bookshelf. "What's wrong, Roan?" Ryder took out a piece of toilet paper to wipe his hands and asked hurriedly, "What did you find?" "Yeah." Roan nodded. He found that the bookshelf was movable. Ryder's eyes lit up, and he hurriedly moved the desk away. Roan also took the opportunity to pull the bookshelf outward. A safe and a whiteboard covered with photos suddenly appeared in front of the two. There were a lot of photos on the day shift, but there were only 6 main characters, 4 men and 2 women. Carolina Bellos was one of the women, and a big red cross was drawn on her photo at this time. In addition, there were also big red crosses on the photos of 3 other men. It is not difficult to see that the 3 of them are likely to have died at the hands of Jorgen Landry. Shit. Fouquet. Ryder's face changed when he saw this, and Roan also cursed in a low voice and immediately took out his mobile phone to call the number 5 investigation team. The identities of the 3 male victims can be checked later. The most urgent task is to find out the specific identities of the 2 remaining photos that have not been crossed out. Son of. In the office of the number 5 investigation team, William frowned and cursed, but he quickly found out the identities of the man and woman. Roan, the woman's name is Kimura Kara, and she is one of the prison guards in a certain prison. Very good. After hearing William's words, Roan continued to ask, "Where is she now? Can we contact her?" Several technicians of the number 5 investigation team typed on the keyboard so fast that their 10 fingers were almost leaving after images. After a few seconds, William slammed the table and said angrily, "Shit. Kimura Kara was shot in the street half an hour ago and died on the spot. Half an hour ago." Riyad, who was standing by, looked even uglier when he heard this. Just as he was about to speak, the phone in his pocket suddenly rang. Glancing at Riyad, Roan continued to ask, "What's the name of the remaining man in the photo? What's his identity?" "His name is Bokayan Base." Without waiting for William to answer, Mona, who was sitting not far from him, immediately answered loudly, "He is a policeman from the NYPD. He is on administrative leave because he shot and killed an armed criminal on the street some time ago." Roan nodded, and just as he was about to continue talking, Riyad on the side suddenly walked up, patted him on the shoulder, and then pointed to his mobile phone and said, "The call was from Lassie. She said your call was unreachable. Edwin Miller in the hospital is 100% sure that the person who bought the gun is Georgian Landry. Well done." After patting Riyad's shoulder hard, Roan continued to ask on the phone, "Mona, where is Officer Bokayan Base home?" After getting the exact address of the policeman's home, Roan stood there thinking for a few seconds, turned around, tore off the photos of the 6 people on the whiteboard, and stuffed them into his pocket, and then shouted into the phone, "First, immediately send SWAT team members to the house under my feet to wait for Georgian Landry. Second, Mona, you and Lassie go to the scene where the female prison guard Kimura Kara was shot and killed. Check the surveillance videos in the nearby area and find Georgian Landry. Third, immediately issue a wanted order for Georgian Landry so that every NYPD patrol officer on duty knows what he looks like. Fourth, Georgian Landry's next target is likely to be Officer Bokayan Base. Ryder and I will go to Kayan Base's house now, and you send a team of SWAT team members to follow, and we will meet there." After hearing Roan's order, the detectives of the number 5 investigation team and Ryder all looked calm and shouted loudly, "Understood. Good." Roan nodded with satisfaction, hung up the phone, and immediately ran to the sub with Ryder. There were 2 NYPD patrol officers near the house, and the nanny and the house were temporarily handed over to them. Officer Kayan Base's home was some distance away, but with Roan's driving skills, the sub arrived at his home quickly. "Hello." The number 5 investigation team had already contacted Bokayan Base in advance. Seeing Roan and Riyad, who were fully armed, walk out of the car, he hurriedly welcomed them into his home. "Hello." It would take a long time for the SWAT team to arrive here. Roan simply greeted Kayan Base and immediately took out 6 photos from his pocket. After briefly describing the case, he asked, "Officer Kayan Base, can you remember anything?" Chapter 175 Bazooka. Roan and Riyad sat down in the living room on the first floor of Kayan Base's house. Kayan Base took the 6 photos with a very gloomy face. Just as he was about to speak, a clear female voice suddenly came from the second floor of the house. "Dad." Roan looked up and saw a little girl wearing pink cat pajamas, who looked about 6 or 7 years old, rubbing her eyes and throwing herself into Kayan Base's arms. "I'm scared, sorry." Seeing his daughter in his arms, Kayan Base's gloomy face disappeared instantly, replaced by a face full of doting. After whispering a few words of comfort in his daughter's ear, Kayan Base raised his head and said apologetically, "This is my daughter, Donna." Roan and Riyad smiled and waved their hands to apologize to the little girl. It was all their fault for waking her up. According to Mona's information, Donna's mother died when she gave birth to her. Roan and Riyad were both tolerant enough for the girl who was targeted by fate. Children's tempers come and go quickly, and now it was night, so little Donna acted like a spoiled child for a while and soon fell asleep in Bokayan Base's arms. She's always like this. Holding little Donna in his arms, Kayan Base wiped the saliva from the corners of her mouth, looked up and smiled at Luo An and Riyad. "She always wakes up several times every night." Luo An didn't know what to say about this topic, but Riyad nodded in agreement. "I understand you. I have a son, and he was like this when he was a child." Riyad admired Kayan Base very much. It's not easy to be a single father, not to mention that Kayan Base's child is a daughter, and he is a policeman himself. The two chatted briefly about the issue of taking care of children when they were young, and then hurriedly talked about business. Looking at the 6 photos on the table, Kyan Basie looked solemn. After thinking for a moment, he picked up a photo of a white man and said, "I don't remember the name Jojen Landry, nor do I remember any case I handled that was related to him. But I remember this man. I forgot his specific name, but he is a lawyer." Lawyer? Ryder's expression changed when he heard that Kyan Basie didn't remember any clues related to Jojen Landry. But when he heard that the man in the photo was a lawyer, Ryder's mood lifted again. At this moment, Luo An, who was sitting on the sofa, suddenly felt uncomfortable all over his body, and it seemed as if his butt was on fire. Remembering that he had drunk a bottle of Danger Sense potion, chapter 57, before, Luo An's face changed, and he quickly got up, took out his pistol, and walked to the window. Seeing this, Ryder on the side hurriedly left the sofa, took out his weapon and asked, "What's wrong, Luo?" Before Ryder could finish his words, a bright fire suddenly flew here from behind the grey pickup truck across the street. Seeing this, Luo An turned around and shouted, "Get down!" Just before Luo An shouted, Riyad and Kyan Basie also saw the fire outside the house. Both of them were well-trained personnel. Hearing Luo An's words, Kyan Basie hurriedly hugged little Donna tightly in his arms and lay down on the spot. Riyad was wearing a bulletproof vest. In order to protect Basie, a single father and a witness, he rushed to him. The next second, accompanied by a long strip of orange-yellow flame, the shining fire hit the master bedroom on the second floor of the house. A violent explosion suddenly sounded. Boom. The flames shot up to the sky, the ground was full of debris, and the cars on the whole street began to sound. Luo An, who was hiding in the corner of the wall on the first floor, was hit hard by the shock wave generated by the explosion, and his internal organs felt a pain. However, because of a bottle of physical strength potion after meals every day, Luo An's body's resistance to pressure is far better than before. Fouquet. This is a fucking bazooka. Resisting the discomfort from all parts of his body, Luo An pushed away the wooden board with anger on his face, took out 2 stun grenades from his pocket without saying a word, and threw them across the house. Bang, bang. 2 explosions sounded, but unfortunately, the enemy across the house had already driven away immediately after launching the bazooka. %. Touching the wound next to his left eye caused by glass fragments, Luo An's face was extremely ugly. He wanted to drive directly to chase the other party, but a strong smell of blood suddenly penetrated into Luo An's nostrils. He turned his head hurriedly and saw that Riyad and others were buried under the wooden board in the middle of the living room. He lifted the wooden board with force, and Riyad lay on Kyan Basie's body. His head was hit hard by the wooden board that fell from the second floor, and he was now unconscious. As for Kyan Basie, Riyad only protected his key parts such as his heart and brain. Kyan Basie's 2 exposed thighs were pierced with 2 wooden boards, one long and one short. Blood was gushing out like crazy, and he completely lost consciousness. The only one who was not seriously injured was little Donna. She was firmly protected in Kyan Basie's arms. Although she was frightened in her sleep and had several small cuts on her arms and thighs from the glass, she did not suffer any other serious injuries. She was crying loudly into Kyan Basie. Although the community where Kyan Basie lived was not a wealthy area, there were many police patrolling nearby. Saving people was important. Luo An could not bear to see little Donna lose her police father again after losing her mother. Opening the system page and taking out a bottle of hemostatic agent, Luo An poured it directly into Kyan Basie's mouth in a place where little Donna could not see. At this time, there were also some large and small wounds on several parts of Luo An and Riyad's exposed bodies. Although it was not deep, it was not a solution to keep bleeding, especially the wound next to Luo An's eye. In addition, Roan was going to hunt down the enemy, so he immediately took out the second bottle of hemostatic medicine, drank half of it himself, and fed the other half into Riyad's mouth. Beep, beep. At this moment, the patrolmen near this area also rushed over. FBI. My name is Roan Greenwood. After loudly announcing his identity, Roan immediately shouted to the 3 patrolmen who came, "The murderer drove a grey pickup truck and just left here not long ago. You quickly block this area. In addition, the other party just used a rocket launcher. It is possible that he has other high threat weapons." Understood. Hearing Roan's order, the 3 patrolmen agreed loudly, with a clear division of labor, and immediately began to report the matter, apply to block this area, and call patrolmen from other areas to come to support, and urge ambulances to come here to rescue the wounded. Seeing this, Roan wiped the blood on his right face, and handed little Donna to one of the patrolmen. Looking back, he saw that, although the wounds on Kyan Basie and Riyadh had not recovered, they were no longer bleeding. He immediately turned around and walked towards the SUV not far away. Agent Roan. Seeing Roan start the SUV, the patrolman holding Donna hurriedly shouted, "The ambulance will be here soon. Don't you want a nurse to check your body?" "No, I'm in good health. Thank you for your concern." Roan turned his head and grinned. The wound next to his left eye looked a little hideous under the light of the fire. "I'm going to catch this guy who dared to use a rocket launcher now." For law enforcement officers, long guns and short guns have never been the same concept. When the NYPD kills an enemy who uses a pistol, there will always be a lot of people in the court saying this and that. But there are fewer people who kill an enemy who uses a long gun. And now, the other party dares to use a rocket launcher, a powerful weapon. Thinking of the thing in the refrigerator and the photos on the whiteboard, Roan's eyes flashed coldly. He is now more and more interested in the identity of Georgian Landry. Boom. He stepped on the accelerator hard, and the black SUV followed the route of the grey pickup truck and instantly rushed into the distant night. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.